drop my remote. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Max, and my talk is titled H.264 Katana, which is the toolkit that I started building with Professor Meyer Patel. And my subtitle is Slicing and Dicing H.264 Compressed to Video Files. And in this talk, I will attempt to give you a very brief overview of sort of video compression in general, how it works, the different techniques that are used, then talk a little bit about the H.264 codec specifically and why we care about it, and then talk about the toolkit. So I'm going to be pretty apparently, so yes, we'll have time at the end for questions. So if I'm not making any sense at all, then you can alert me, and otherwise we will be able to talk at the end. And you'll see some images. They're either from Wikipedia or they're from this book right here, which is basically the one book in the world that covers H.264 as codec. It's a pretty good book. If you're interested, you should read it. So video compression. So sort of in general, any sort of video codec sort of follows a general pattern. Here's the pattern. You start with raw video. You convert the color spaces from the normal RGB to a chroma luma system, so you can save space. And I'll talk more about each of these bits, but just sort of giving you the overview. You have the sort of prediction model, which is sort of the core of the codec. And there are two types. It's sort of subdivided into spatial compression, which is within a frame, and motion vectors, which are between different frames. We have two portions. We have the prediction that was made by the codec, and then we subtract that prediction from the original frame to get a residual, which is sort of the difference between the two. And then we keep some of that residual because just using the prediction would be pretty bad. So that residual we actually you do some lossy compression on. We transform it, and then we quantize it. And then both the prediction and the residual we use entropy coding on, and then you end up with compressed video in your favorite format. So first thing is about color space compression. So most computer scientists are probably used to thinking of color in sort of red, green, blue, sort of the standard 3 different colors pixels. You add them together and you get a color, but that's not necessarily how the human eye sees. The human eye sort of has both rods and cones, and they see sort of one sees color and one sees just sort of brightness and luminance. So it actually makes more sense to show pictures like this one, sort of split them up into a luma field, which is just sort of the black and white picture, and then chroma fields, which are actually just sort of the color additions to that picture. And you actually only need to store 2 chroma fields with the luma field. You don't actually need to store 3 colors because you can subtract the 2 chroma fields from the luma field to get the 3rd color. And the reason why we would actually want to do this in practice is because the eye is a lot more sensitive to luma, to the sort of the black and white, to the details, than to the color. So what we can actually do is we can save a lot of space by actually shrinking the amount of color information that's stored and sort of then upsampling it later. And it saves a lot of space, but doesn't have that much of a visual change. So the most common format is 420, which is full-size luma, and then you basically half both dimensions of chroma of the 2 different chroma blocks, which means that you actually are throwing away like half of the data right off the top. And this is used in JPEG, this is used in H.264, this is a pretty common way to compress things, to just sort of start compressing things without losing a lot of data. And prediction model. So I was talking, there are 2 different parts of a prediction model. First one is spatial compression, that sort of objects in nature tend to have spatial coherence. They tend to sort of be of a same or similar color or same or similar texture. So like one block, so what we can do is we can separate a whole video frame into smaller blocks, and then one block is most likely going to be similar in type or similar in color to, similar to blocks around it. So we can actually use spatial compression and have blocks in a frame be able to be defined by referring back to previous blocks in that same frame. And the reason I showed you this example, this is a very highly compressed JPEG image, and if you can actually sort of see that there are different blocks, that the macro block, the blocks here that were used in encoding the picture are very visible. So if you go, if you see overcompressed video, overcompressed pictures, you can often see things getting blocky, and that's because sort of the macro blocks, the blocks that it was split up into sort of are getting more and more different, and they're not being smoothed over very well. So you can sort of see the difference. And then the other way to do this is to refer back to previous frames. That because video is sort of like a series of pictures that, the eye, we sort of want to trick the eye into seeing that it's one sort of complete motion. The pictures are often very, very similar to each other with perhaps some small changes in between them. So what we can do is we can actually take a previous picture and then apply different vectors to different parts of the picture and sort of shift the pixels around. And then we end up sort of with a new frame, which is sort of our basis for predicting that current frame. And then basically, as I was saying earlier, we sort of have a split between the prediction, which is what the codec thinks is sort of the best guess of the codec, and then and then we sort of subtract. We have an original macro block, and then we have a prediction. In this case, it's a within the frame prediction. It's sort of a generic gradient, but this side is darker than the other side, so it sort of fits a little bit. And then we subtract these two to get the residual, and basically, what we want to do is we want to store some of this residual with the prediction so that when we decode the file again, we make the prediction and then we apply the residual back to it so we get something that actually sort of looks like what we originally started. And that's one of the big things that's one of the big differences between sort of low video, very small, low quality files and big high quality files is that you have more data. You have more space to put more residual data in, so the picture looks better. And you can do this with interprediction too. So once you actually have this data, once you have this residual data, you have a lot of data, and you don't want to put it all in the file because then it would make it too big. So there are various ways of decreasing that amount of size, decreasing that size. And the first way is using sort of a transform, like a discrete cosine transform. So what you do is you basically have this original block, and then you apply cosine with different coefficients to it to get a series of coefficients. And you're like, oh, look, that's great. Now I have, instead of having 16 values, I now have 16 coefficients. And man, isn't this such a great savings? But what you can actually do is you can approximate the original block. Oh, sorry. The thing about the discrete cosine transform is it actually separates your data into it sorts your data from sort of like low frequency data to high frequency data. So what you can do is you can actually start cutting off the highest coefficients, and it will get rid of high frequency data, so like very fine details. So and then you can sort of reconstruct the picture, and it won't be exactly the same. It'll be a little bit blurrier. Some of the details will sort of be missing, but it'll look more or less the same. It'll look similar because our eyes sort of are more interested in the low frequency details than the high frequency details. So you can recompress. So with one coefficient, all you can get is like the average, because that's sort of the lowest frequency information. But as you do more, you can sort of see that you can quickly get something that starts to approximate the original file while using like a very small percentage of the actual data. Then one of the last tricks I'll talk about is quantization, which is basically reducing granularity. If you have this range, if you have a value which can be in a certain range, and you want to store that value but not store that full, but you want to compress the amount of size, you can actually quantize it by just dividing it by a number and then storing that divided number. So in this case, we're dividing by 8. And then if you want to unquantize back, you just multiply by 8 and then add 4. And then you have results that are similar to the original ones, but not precisely. You've lost some of the finer details in there, but you get something that's like the original value, which is good in video compression because you want to store something small that sort of approximates the original version. And then the last thing I'll talk about is entropy coding. The last thing I'll talk about in the introductory section will be entropy coding. So entropy coding is basically the idea that if you know how probable your various tokens in your input can be, then you can sort of get rid of fixed length encoding, that everything is the same length, and say things that are more often should be shorter, should be easier to put on disk. And the way arithmetic coding does this is it actually encodes one number which sort of represents all your data. And this number is sort of a decimal between 0 and 1, which is sort of calculated in the following manner. You sort of split up the range from 0 to 1 into sort of in areas based on probability. So as we see here, 0 is the most probable thing because there's the widest range. And then -1 and plus or minus 1 is more probable than getting plus or minus 2. And what you do when you store is you basically go through that range. You say, if my first value was a 0, then I'm going to store a value in between 0.3 and 0.7. And you sort of rescale 0.3 and 0.7 to fill your whole range. And then you repeat the process. So every time you're encoding a new element, you're getting a smaller range of values. And then once you've encoded all your values, you suddenly have a range in which, if you encode any number in this range, it will represent all these values. So generally what's done is you go to a certain period, you have a certain precision you can put variables in. Sorry, you can record decimals in, and you record the value, and you also record how many coefficients you stored in there, so it sort of knows when to stop. And you can sort of do an inverse process to get that back out. So H.264. Sorry, that was a bit of a whirlwind tour, but H.264 is probably the most well-used, I want to say the most well-used, or if not one of the most well-used video codecs sort of in the world today. It's used on Blu-ray. It's one of the 3 possible video codecs that you can use on Blu-ray discs for HD video. It's also sort of like YouTube's one of YouTube's primary, if not the primary format for its videos. So the sort of disparity of this really shows one of H.264's strengths is that many codecs beforehand were either designed to compress high quality video, or they're designed to compress video a lot and get it on a mobile device. But there weren't really all that many good codecs that could compress everything on a wide range of bit rates and still work very well. So H.264 is unusual in the fact that it scales all the way down to mobile devices and all the way up to high definition video, and it compresses very well sort of in that whole range. And then Apple uses it for basically everything they have with video. And then it is one of the 2 front-runner codecs for the HTML5 sort of video standard. And yeah, I can get into that later, but we don't have time in this talk. So the actual standard is the H.264/MPEG-4 Part 10 Advanced Video Coding. So basically, there are 2 standardization groups. There's the ISO/ISEG Motion Picture Experts group, and they're the people responsible for what you know as MP3 files, MPEG-1 and MPEG-2 layer 3 audio compression. They're the ones responsible for the MPEG-2 codec. Well, it was a joint thing again, but they got their name. MPEG-2, which is the standard that DVDs have. And if you had an MPEG-1 file, like a .mpg file that you've ever played on your computer, that was, again, an MPEG standard. And then they joined forces with the International Telecommunications Union's Video Coding Experts Group, and one of their big codecs before was H.263, which was used for teleconferencing. And they joined together to the Joint Video Team and formed this specification, the international standard H.264, or MPEG-4 Part 10. They're different standards, but they have the identical text. And as you sort of hopefully have gleaned from me talking nonstop for the past 13 minutes now, this is actually a pretty complex, sort of a video compression is a very complex issue, and H.264 being one of the probably the most advanced codec on the world today, it is actually a very, very complex thing. The spec itself is 672 pages long. This is about half of it. This is the half we were using right now. And the reason it's so long is because it specifies very precisely many, many different features, many different configurations, many different extensions. There are about 8 different extensions to this format. Because it's designed to work so well everywhere that they just had all these different configuration settings to optimize for certain areas. And just some of the things that H.264 does separately, sort of the generic thing in a H.264 stream is an NAL unit, which stands for Network Abstraction Layer Unit, which is basically, you sort of think of it as like a network packet to some extent, that it's sort of a generic unit that contains a video or contains configuration information, or it contains just sort of all of the H.264 different elements, but they sort of abstract it into an NAL unit so they can be sent over the network and streamed. Slices. So I was talking in my first section about frames. I was talking about video frames, and you did this and you did that with a video frame. Well, in H.264, on the syntactic level, they don't really think of it as frames. They think in terms of slices, which are contiguous groups of macro blocks of blocks. So like one frame can actually have several slices on it. So they sort of add another layer of sort of indirection. And then QP, I was talking about quantization. In my example, we just divided by 8. And in H.264, there's actually this complicated function there's this function that looks at the value that it's compressing and the value QP that was set, which is sort of a master tuning block because, the more data you keep in quantization, the larger the file, but the better the quality will be. But here, it sort of adjusts what it's dividing values by depending on like how large the value already is. That it wants to keep granularity in large values and then sort of make small values sort of shrink away. So, and then KBAC is one of the biggest things. KBAC is context-aware binary arithmetic encoding, or coding, not encoding. So KBAC, I talked a little bit about arithmetic coding very briefly. So binary arithmetic encoding is, So H.264 is one of its star features. One of the reasons it has such much better performance than most of the codecs beforehand is its adaptive binary encoding. That it's a binary arithmetic encoding so that the only two choices are 0 and 1. So there's this the split in the middle sort of goes back and forth depending on, they actually have over 1,000 different contexts, 1,000 different positions, and sort of you determine when decoding each element what context you're actually in, which determines what probability you're in, which determines how likely you are to get a 0 or 1. And the other part is that it's context adapt. Actually, it might be context aware. It is. But basically what happens is that the values it gets out of the previous values gotten out of KBAC are actually put back into the system and adjust the probabilities. So getting one bit out of KBAC isn't just about what context are you in and what are you decoding. It's also about what have you decoded previous to this. So it's this sort of whole enormous, it's great for compression, but it's also sort of this big mess for people trying to decode it, like us. H.264, you may know there's both progressive and interlaced types of videos, and H.264 handles both natively, and in fact, it can actually encode a progressive stream as interlaced internally, but it's still progressive. So all these algorithms have to be changed depending on whether you're progressive or whether you're interlaced. And then, oh no, my clicker died. Okay, we're moving on. And then profiles. So H.264 is very, very complex. So as I've been saying, to prevent people from just not implementing it at all, because if you had to implement everything, that'd be absurd. So they actually have these things called profiles, which are subsets of the features which are acceptable in different types of situations. So like my iPhone can only play the constraint, I forget, I think it's the mainline profile. So it can only play a subset of the features available, and their H.264 streams can have different profiles, which is sort of interesting and useful for the implementer, but sort of adds complexity if we're trying to just decode the system in general, decode a stream sort of generally. And then I need to forget about that. Levels are sort of orthogonal to profiles. That levels sort of say how much data can you handle at once. That you could compress, you could be able to handle very high quality streams but decode them very slowly. So you would have a low level but a high profile. So it's complex is sort of what I'm trying to get at. And in fact, I was talking about video frames and sort of sequences of frames, and then down to macro blocks. And you see the chroma blocks are smaller than the other blocks and the luma blocks. And then see in the H.264 bit stream we have NAL units and slices and macro blocks and coefficients. And the thing is that sort of all the codecs today want to sort of care about this. They care about getting from the bit stream, the fully encoded bit stream, to the fully decoded picture as fast as humanly possible, because they want it to run on as cheap hardware as possible. Like, you really just care about the final picture. So they sort of hide or ignore or sort of do shortcuts around as many of the intermediate values as possible. But we actually care about the intermediate values because we actually want to look inside the bit stream and figure out what's actually going on and sort of do empirical analyses and say, what if we change this and put it all back together again? What would actually happen? So we care very much about these syntax elements, but we couldn't really we couldn't instrument a current codec to deal with it because they just do so many shortcuts. So enter H.264 Katana. So this, again, is sort of a description of H.264. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to basically unravel the very, very complex bit stream of an H.264 file into sort of layer by layer, first into NAL units, then into slices, then into macro blocks, then inside the macro block to all the different components inside an actual macro block. We wanted to figure that out. So we wanted to just do it layer by layer and provide APIs, provide streams, provide interfaces for researchers or for anyone who wanted to use our system to be able to pull out, say, I'm only interested in macro blocks. Give me a stream of macro blocks and I will play around with them and do whatever I want. We didn't want to sort of assume that people would only want certain parts of the image or certain parts of the picture. So, and then they could tweak we wanted to make this big object hierarchy and then tweak it and then reassemble it. And again, we wanted researchers to have direct access. We wanted to give them streams. We wanted to give them relationships. And we wanted to sort of make the values as friendly as possible. One of the things when we wrote H.264 Katana, we tried to write the code as much as possible in a way that makes more sense than the spec, that sort of is more friendly, that the values sort of make more sense. And I am actually over time, so I'm going to stop here and ask for questions. So. Sorry. So that's actually a great question, but I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So I did practice the talk. Thank you. But sorry. So we built this framework. So let me go 2 slides. So you could have gotten all those exciting things, but we did not manage to. We managed to pull apart a stream through KBack and decode sort of like intra macro blocks. We didn't manage to do motion vectors and sort of all the links between different frames, and we didn't manage to actually put that bit stream once we had separated this into this object hierarchy all back together. But we did manage to sort of open it up to some extent and provide an interface that people could use, and then sort of provide the groundwork that people later, like the impressionable sophomores here, could extend later, and it's super fun. So the world is a better place because now people can actually, instead of theorizing in general about video codecs or about, here's the relationship between this type of value or not, they can just actually take a corpus of files, open them up, look at those values, and actually empirically figure out things, and then even try changing things and putting it back together and seeing whether their hypotheses are correct. It's really a toolkit for researchers and for further development of the system.
And that's a great thing. Thank you,
Sorry.
Right, so I'm Abhishek, and I'm going to be presenting, as Dr. Jaffe said, optimizing ancestry inference for complex pedigrees. And you just got a whirlwind tour of video codecs and compression techniques, and now you're going to get a very brief whirlwind tour of biology in preparation for understanding what my talk is about. And that's one of the great things about bioinformatics, actually, is that we bring together all of biology and statistics and probability and linear algebra and computer science all under one umbrella. So we'll begin with what exactly genetic code is, DNA, that sort of thing. So DNA is basically the molecule that stores genetic code for living organisms. It's a sequence of bases, adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine, which you write ATCG. And they come in pairs, A pairs with T, C pairs with G. We call them complementary base pairs. And the actual DNA molecules in a human or a mouse or that sort of organism is actually split up into several chunks called chromosomes. And so I've got some example sequence up at the top there. Now, you may know that there are regions of DNA called genes, and that genes code for proteins, and proteins do very interesting things in organisms. But we're actually going to ignore all of that. We're instead going to focus on a specific type of mutation called a single nucleotide polymorphism. That's where one base flips between 2 different values among members in the population. And because it flips between 2 values, we can encode it using either 0 or 1. So that second line there is called a haplotype, and it gives the state for every SNP at every position in the chromosome. Now, humans and mice are actually sort of special because we actually have 2 copies of every chromosome. One is inherited from our mother, and one is inherited from our father. And the issue comes up is that when we decide to measure what the state of a SNP is, we can't distinguish between the 2 copies of this chromosome. So you get this third line here, which is a genotype sequence. And the very important thing to take away from this is that we can't distinguish this 0, 1 from this 1, 0. We can only detect that either the 2 states are 0 or both states are 1, and then the third possibility is one of the states is 1, but we don't know which one it is. That's actually going to become really important when we get into what exactly we're inferring. Now, that's one source of genetic variation, but there's another source of genetic variation we're interested in, because this whole picking 2 chromosomes, your mother had 2 chromosomes, but you inherit one of them. And the process by which that whole process of choosing happens is called meiosis. And there's another specific part of meiosis that we're really interested in, which is this phase right here called prophase 1, where the chromosomes come together in the middle of the cell. And what actually happens is that there's a chance that that the 2 copies can actually exchange genetic material. We call that crossover recombination. So this point right here, we call that the point where the recombination happened. And what ends up happening is that you inherit one of these 2 copies, except that it has a piece of the other copy spliced onto it. Now, this whole pedigree thing is basically the issue is we want to provide a resource to biologists doing experiments who want to associate genetic features such as SNPs with physical traits. And the resource that we're developing here at UNC is a mouse population called the collaborative cross. And basically, we take 8 canonical lab mouse strains, and we cross them together in this well, it's actually not that complicated, but I'm calling it complex for a very specific reason. But essentially, what ends up happening is that we recombine all of the ancestral DNA sequences due to crossover recombinations and the fact that you only get 1 copy from each of your parents. And the point is that we get, at the end of it, mice with unmatched genetic diversity, which means that they're very useful for determining which traits are associated with which features. Now, the definition of complex that I'm using here is solely based on the number of individuals in this pedigree. We want the end individuals here to be completely inbred so that we can completely reproduce their genotypes so that we can continue to provide this resource. The issue is that that takes a lot of generations of inbreeding. Theoretically, it takes 20. In actual practice, it actually takes more. We're actually getting close to 20 generations and finding out that things are not inbred. So the total number of animals in this pedigree is going to become important. And now I'll get into what exactly is ancestry inference. So based on that picture, what we want to do is, given a pedigree, like that picture before, and for our purposes, a pedigree is a directed acyclic graph. Every node corresponds to an animal, and it has 2 edges pointing to its mother and its father. And actually, there are there's one property of this pedigree, this graph, on top of that, which is that every node either has out degree 0, in which case neither of its parents are in the pedigree. We call those founders. Or both of its parents are in the pedigree. Out degree 2, we call them non-founders. So we have a set of founder genotypes. So in that previous picture, those top 8 mouse strains, we have the complete genotypes for. We have the descendant genotype sequence. So from some animal at the bottom of that pedigree, we have genotypes for. And now, for every single SNP in that genotype sequence, and for every single pair of founders at the top of that pedigree, we want to know what is the probability that that SNP came from those 2 founders. And this seems like a totally intractable problem. And as it turns out, it actually is. But just to give you an idea of what the tool that we have developed actually does, this graph here shows probabilities on the y-axis, genomic position on the x-axis. This is for chromosome 1. And the various colors correspond to different pairs of founders. So in that pedigree that I showed, the collaborative cross pedigree, there are 8 founders. There are 36 possible pairs. And essentially what we get is we can very accurately determine that with very high probability and very high confidence that some region of the genome, like say this one, came from whatever pair corresponds to orange. So how do we go about doing that? And as I mentioned, it actually is intractable. So the intuition behind what we're doing, we need to know where recombination happened everywhere in this pedigree. And that's really hard because we only have genotypes at two ends of it. So we have to model how genes get passed down from mother to son and father to son, and that all of that for every single animal in this pedigree. And that's why the number of animals in the pedigree becomes important. Because the way we're going to encode where each chromosome came from, we need one bit to say which one of the mother's chromosomes that particular copy came from, and another one bit for which copy the father's chromosome came from. There's 2 bits for every single animal in this pedigree. And then we need to try every single possible way of doing that. So that's exponential in the number of animals in the pedigree. And that's why this problem is intractable. But assuming you can do all that, and you have gene flow for this site, one SNP, and the gene flow for the SNP next to it, you can infer a recombination has happened if the bit patterns changed. And then you can assign probabilities to that, and you can determine at the end what is the probability that this sequence came from that pair of founders. And in fact, what this really is a probabilistic model called a hidden Markov model. And essentially what we're doing is we're saying, in this process of getting a descendant genotype through this pedigree, we assume that there's some probabilistic process that it's a state machine, basically. And the state is what the gene flow is at that site. And so we say that essentially the state changes at every SNP, but we don't get to observe that. Instead, what we observe is the output of it, which is the descendant genotype sequence. And once you get that model, where states are what we call inheritance vectors, which encode where all these things came from, and the output sequences of genotypes, you get what's called the Landau-Green algorithm. And basically, once you've got the Markov model, there's an algorithm called the forward-backward algorithm that will let you compute probabilities of being in a certain state given the entire genotype sequence. And that's actually what we're going to use to come up with the final answer. The problem is that because I said the number of states is exponential, the time complexity of this algorithm is also exponential. And as it turns out, we can't actually do anything about that. We have to model every single animal. But before I get into so the first optimization is this forward-backward algorithm depends on a matrix multiply. And the matrix is what is the probability of going from one state to another state. That's what all the entries are. But this matrix has a certain structure to it. And because it has this structure, we can actually replace an n squared time vector matrix multiply with an n log n time vector matrix multiply that looks like this. And so essentially what this means is this matrix has size 2 to the 2k. And we can define it in terms of a matrix that is half the size. And we can multiply half the vector. So we can go down to a vector of size 1, which is trivial, and then reconstruct the answer all the way back up. So it's an n log n time matrix multiply. And so now our 2 to the 4n became n times 2 to the 2n, but it's still exponential. And like I said, we can't do anything about that. But remember I said the number of animals in the pedigree was really important. And as it turns out, you don't actually have to model every single animal in the collaborative cross pedigree or in other pedigrees that have inbreeding. And the reason is, in inbreeding, you have 4 alleles at the start of it. And because they're inbred, the 2 descendants inherit from those 4 alleles. So really what's happening is the 4 alleles are just getting shuffled around in all those generations. So you don't have to actually model how they get shuffled around as long as you do the probabilities correctly. So that's what we do. We detect inbreeding. We replace all the nodes in the pedigree with a new special node, which we call a quaternary indicator. And it's got a different set of transition probabilities for it. And what that means is that now our inheritance vector has length m plus 4k. M is the number of non-founders that are not involved in inbreeding. And 4k is 4 bits for these 2 additional indicators that we added on. In practice, what this means is we reduce the running time by a factor of 2 to the 40. And that actually makes it so we can actually run this in some reasonable amount of time. And you can go even further than this, because in the collaborative cross, all of the founder strains are inbred, which means that no recombination is observable. And what that means is you don't even have to model the second generation of collaborative cross. That's 4 additional animals that you can remove and reduce the running time by another factor of 256. So what have I done in solving this problem? So I have implemented 2 versions of this tool on top of a first version implemented by a graduate student here. The first version of this tool assumed that the input was for the collaborative cross. And that means it can use all of the optimizations I just described. But it also means that it's not very useful to people outside of UNC. And we're collaborating with all sorts of people outside of UNC. And so this new version does not assume that the pedigree is collaborative cross. It actually takes the pedigree as input and does some processing on it. So there are 2 versions of it. First one is in Python, which was really fun to write. It's also really, really slow. So I had to rewrite it in C. And that is publicly available, or will be publicly available pretty shortly at the URL up there. Now, why is ancestry inference an important problem? So I'm going to tie this back to the collaborative cross first. Collaborative cross is a tool that we want other people to use, which means that we want to show that it has nice properties that other people can take advantage of. And so one of the nice properties is genetic diversity. We want to show that all of these animals have equal contributions from all of the 8 founders. There's no bias introduced in this breeding scheme. That's actually the original purpose of why this tool was developed. But once we have this hidden Markov model optimizations and we make the analysis, we can do all sorts of other useful things. So for example, if you know that some segment of the genome comes from some pair of founders, you can go back to those founder genotypes and reconstruct what the descendant genotype should be, because you know that it came from these 2. And then what you can do is you can compare it to the genotype sequence that you got as input. And so we've actually done this. We've actually detected genotyping errors in some of the collaborative cross mice. Another thing we've done is, because we know where we think the founders have changed, where recombinations have happened, we also know how many recombinations we expect for a given generation inside the collaborative cross, inside that breeding process. And what that means is we can actually detect when someone did something wrong and bred the 2 wrong mice together. And that's actually happened before. And we got a nonsense answer out, and we thought, is there a bug in our program? And then we went back and looked at what was actually going on. It turns out that there was a breeding error. So I'll also mention some other biological problems very briefly. I don't have enough time to explain what they are. But haplotype inference, genotype imputation, linkage mapping, and association mapping. These are 4 very important problems that are all very, very closely related to ancestry inference and this whole hidden Markov model approach of doing things. And if you want to ask me about them during the question and answer session or during the reception, please feel free to. And for future work, the implementation right now is in a sort of state of flux. There are lots of things that I want to do, but I really don't have time to do. So for people that are ambitious, you could try tackling some of these things. So I described a way to optimize hidden Markov model for inbreeding. There are other repetitive structures and pedigrees that we might want to optimize for and that we could see useful benefits from, such as backcrossing. The actual implementation of this whole vector matrix multiply and that whole mess, there's a whole lot of work in making that part more efficient. So doing things like using sparse vectors and sparse matrices, doing things like turning this vector matrix multiply into a fast Fourier transform, because then you can get really nice speedups. All of these things are possible additions on top of all the other optimizations. And the last thing that I've listed here for association mapping is actually work that I'll be presenting tomorrow for a data mining research seminar. Basically, once you know the haplotypes for a particular set of animals, and now you want to determine what genetic features are associated with the actual physical traits that you've measured for those animals. One of the key problems there is that if the animals that you're doing this for are genetically related, then the answers you're going to get are going to be basically bogus. You're going to get lots of false positives. And one way to account for that is to use the output of this tool as a way to more accurately account for how related different organisms in this whole set are. And so if you're interested in hearing about that, come by tomorrow at 11 a.m. or talk to me about it. And so with that, I'd like to acknowledge Yi Liu, the graduate student who implemented the first version of this tool and came up with the inbreeding optimization, Wei Wang, my advisor, and UNC Computational Genetics Research Group, which provided the resources for this research. Thank you. Yep.
You mentioned the confounding effects of crossover recombination mitosis. My understanding is those crossover points are limited. They're not so many. So can you extend your HMM to take that into account?
Yes and no. I think the real issue, well, the way it's implemented right now, no. I think it would actually be trivial to do, because really what we end up using, it's just a function of changing the transition probabilities, essentially. The only issue I can see is that because we assume that SNPs are very dense, I'm not sure that changing how that would change, really. I mean, if you know that a certain site is a recombination hotspot, that doesn't change, I don't know how much that changes the probability between two markers that are very close to each other.
You're saying that the average spacing between SNPs is going to be much shorter?
Right. I mean, the assumption that we're making is that SNPs are so dense that there will be maximum one recombination in between them. And that's true for collaborative cross. That may not be true for other applications. Yep.
So what's the relationship between how you formulate your HMM when you're taking out patterns like interbreeding and experimental design of the data you're looking at? So in this case, I think your data only existing.
Right.
Yes, but it seems like if you, it seems like you could structure your experiment in such a way that made it more efficient to formulate your HMM, or you could take things out.
Well, so the short answer to that is you really can't. I mean, so to actually guarantee all the properties that we want, it has to be inbred that long. And I mean, there are other breeding schemes that will produce other types of populations with other sets of desirable properties. Those you can't do this sort of optimization for, and it will actually be less efficient.
Thank you, Abhishek.
Yep.
Absolutely. So, good afternoon. As he said, my name is Cameron Swaim, and I'm here to present to you about my research, which was a browser-based version of the game Sonic Zoom. It's how I'm going to talk to you today about how I use JavaScript, HTML5, and spatial sound as enabling technology, specifically for blind and visually impaired individuals. My research was supervised by Professor Gary Bishop. And okay, so first I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the core problem, and then I'm going to go on and talk to you a little bit about the technology that I used, and then the major issue that we ran into. So the main problem is that in elementary school, middle school, high school, children a few times a week will go to a computer lab and play on the computers. Especially in elementary school, you'd have games like interactive games. You know, you're reading an interactive storybook, or you're doing some kind of edutainment game where there are characters on the screen, you're clicking on them and they're talking to you. But these things leave blind and visually impaired children pretty much out altogether, because there aren't enough sound cues in the game for them to recognize what's going on to make it through. So most of the time this ends up with them sitting doing nothing while these other kids have, 45 minutes or an hour playing on the computers, which sounds pretty horrible. So to solve this issue, we turn to video games, of course, because video games are awesome. Everybody loves video games. Sonic Zoom was a game that was created in 2004 by a group of students, Eden Kung, Matt Clark, Daniel Evans, and Patrick Dwyer, for a software engineering project for Professor Gary Bishop. And it is a game that they made for to fill this gap, so that blind children would have something to do on the computer, and it would be distributed to schools in that fashion. So they made it, and it's got 3D graphics. They produced their own music and sound for it. It's an amazing game. It became a huge hit in the blind and visually impaired community. So the downside is that when they made it, in 2004, they made it as a Windows and DirectX application. So you have to install this game, go to their website, download the 20, 30 megabyte zip file, extract it, put it on your desktop or in a folder, whatever, and then double-click on the exe to run the game, which isn't that much of a problem. But when you're working with IT guys in a school that don't want to download software off some random website and put it on 30 computers in the computer lab because some student wrote it and they're not 100% sure about it, you run into some problems with that. So there needs to be some way to easily distribute this game where you're not having to install a file, you're not having to get it on the computer ahead of time, where you can go to a link or something and it's there. You can do it at school, you can do it at home, you can do it on 40 computers, you can do it on 1,000 computers. And browsers have really started to fill that niche with some of the technologies that are coming out. And this is how my research came about, was to take this game that the blind and visually impaired community love and port it to a way where they can play it without having to go through all the hassle of installing it. And I get to learn about some cool new technologies along the way. So the technologies that I'm going to talk to you about what I use to create this game and port it from, or remake it from their application to the browser. So the first is HTML5. Over the past year or so, it's become a little bit of a buzzword, and it's a pretty awesome new technology. The main thing that I used was the canvas element. You put an element on a page, and you can throw just about anything on there. You can throw images on there, you can throw video on there, you can, edit sprites and all these other things on it, and do lots of snazzy graphics. So that really, really helped move my research forward. And the better multimedia support is also a big hinging point, because with visually impaired and games for blind children, they really need audio cues to tell them and not so much rely on the graphics. So HTML5 multimedia support got a lot better. It's not perfect yet, which we'll get to later in a little bit of issues, but from the previous versions of it, it definitely improved a lot. So another tool I used was Dojo. It's a JavaScript toolkit, and it is coming from Java and object-oriented languages specifically. It had a very well-defined class structure where you make your classes, you define your member variables, you define your functions, which if you've worked in JavaScript before, normally you don't code that way. And it's really tough to work JavaScript to where you can get it that way. So it provides a way to kind of get rid of that learning curve and make it a whole lot easier to come from a language like Java. It also, JavaScript idiosyncrasies, some of the things like scope is a little weird in Java sometimes. And Dojo has a lot of facilities to help handle that. As well as JavaScript likes to be asynchronous a lot of the time. And when you start mixing the asynchronous calls with synchronous calls, it gets a little weird, and it will give you a lot of functions and things to help take care of that. So this, it really helps when you're doing web development. And this is an API for the canvas that works in JavaScript, Easel.js. And it popped up on Professor Bishop's newsfeed. He sent it to me. He said, "This looks awesome." And I said, "Yes, it does look awesome. I'm going to write my project in it." So what it actually is they made it for Flash developers so that they would come away from Flash and move towards the canvas. So it's a very Flash-like API and brings a lot of the same functions to the canvas element, which if you've ever programmed in Flash, they're pretty nice. It's really easy to work with, very, very explicit when you're looking for things to do. And the last tool I'm going to talk about is JSonic. JSonic is a library that was written by Peter Parenti, who is an alumnus from here. He now works for IBM and Emerging Web Technologies. And he made it specifically for UNC, and it's a JavaScript library that does sound and text-to-speech and makes playing sound and reading speech that you give it extremely easy from JavaScript and works very well in web browsers. So, we're going to move on to the basics of Sonic Zoom. So Sonic Zoom is a wonderful game. It's a lot of fun. And the main point of Sonic Zoom is you're in Sonic Zoom. You're a car or spaceship. You're driving down a 3-lane highway. And there are these coins all over the place. And you want to get the coins because the coins mean more points. And you want the highest score possible. So you want to pick up coins, and then later on there are some obstacles. And you want to avoid the obstacles because if you hit 3 obstacles, you die. So I haven't talked much yet about what makes this accessible. But the accessibility of this game is a large point of its hold in the blind and visually impaired community. So what makes this game accessible? Spatial sound. Now spatial sound means, in particular, when you hear a coin coming at you on this 3-lane highway, you want to know whether it's off to your left, you want to know if it's off to your right, you want to know if you're straight in front of it. And to do that, you need to hear it in your left and right ear, a little bit more in your right ear if it's over here, a little bit more in your left ear if it's over here. And if you're farther away from it and it's farther away from you, you want to hear it less over here and less over here, but still more in this ear, which is wonderful when you're building that with most programming languages. You tell it, I want it more left or I want it more right, and it works great. But the downside of working in a browser is spatial sound is not supported. There are no facilities to work with spatial sound. So what you have to do is you have to think up other ways to do it. There's no panning. There's nothing other than basically play a sound file at this volume. So you have to think of some creative solutions to get around what the browser will let you do. And Professor Bishop actually gave me some great advice. I was trying to overthink this and think of complicated ways where we could process the sound and do all this. He was like, don't focus on what the browser is limiting you to. Focus on what you can do right now. And these are the 2 things that we came up with. And the first one is play 2 of the same sound in stereo and manage the volume. So you have a sound that's mixed left, you have a sound that's mixed right, and you do volume up and down depending on how you want it left or right, and all up and all down for distance front to back. Well, that works well, and it's very dynamic in that you can change it as much as you want, but you end up with 2 channels per object. And when you're talking about 3 or 4 objects on the screen, you end up with a lot of channels. And the browsers don't particularly like it when you end up with a lot of channels. They start to slow down and sometimes crash. It just depends on how many you've got going on there. So the second option that we looked at, which is actually the one that I ended up going with, is in Sonic Zoom, you have 3 lanes and about 3 or 4 objects on the screen. So playing separate sound files, you're talking 1 coin, 3 sound files, because there's 3 positions of the ship. So you're only talking about 9 sound files for the coins, which isn't that much. It's extra sound files, but for the versatility that you get of being able to mix them how you need them and then just play them as you need them, it works very well. And as I said, that's what we ended up doing what I ended up doing for the Sonic Zoom game. So, to recap, I programmed a video game. I got to do it in HTML5. I got to write it in Dojo. I got to do spatial sound when it wasn't supported in a browser. And I made the game accessible. So, how about a demo? So, there you go. The game comes up and says press any key to play because you need to say, you're at the game. Let's play it. So,
Sonic Zoom! This is the main menu. Use the up and down arrow keys to go between the different options. Press spacebar when you want to select that option. Training.
okay, so as you can tell, that's not my voice. It's actually the guys that got together and did the original project. they had their sound files in there. So I tried to make it the gameplay experience and everything, where someone coming from the old Sonic Zoom would be able to sit down and play without having to go through the training and all that again, so that it was as close to the original as possible and that all the controls were the same and they aren't going to have to relearn it. So all the sound files are theirs, and I re-encoded them and made them accessible through this web application. So, go ahead.
Or like JavaScript in general stores some files like that.
Y-
Just grab it on those files or
Yes, it does. So the JSonic library takes care of most of that. It'll cache your sound files so that once you play them once, they're there and you won't have to fetch them again. But most of the sound files, I re-encoded them to make sure they were very, very, very small as they could get without sacrificing quality, so that they would go out as fast as they could. Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so
Start training. Start game.
you have your two options, training and start game.
Training.
And if I'll play through the training real quick, it's about a 60-second clip, and we'll learn how to play Sonic Zoom.
How's it going there, Ace? We heard you were the best driver this side of the Mississippi. Well, we need some with your talent. You see, one of our drivers dropped all these coins all over this 3-lane highway. We need you to pick them up for us. This is what one of the coins in the left lane sounds like. A coin in the middle, a coin in the right. Now, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't gonna be dangerous. There are some obstacles out there. Here's what those bad boys sound like. From the left, in the center, in the right. In order for you to do your best out there, I'm willing to give you my favorite car, the Sonic Zoom. Her controls are pretty easy. Use the right and left arrows to switch between the lanes. Use the up and down arrow keys to accelerate. The faster you go, the more you are rewarded. Even though the Sonic Zoom is one of the best cars in the county, she can only take about 3 hits, so be careful out there. Alright, boy. Choose start game and let's start rocking the Sonic Zoom. Sonic Zoom!
Okay.
This is the
And then it goes back to the menu and lets you pick what you want to do next. So we'll go ahead and play through a level or two, and you'll get to see, the ship and the cars and that fun
Start
stuff.
game.
Level 1.
Ready, set, go. Get them coins, boy.
And so I don't know if you guys can tell from where you're sitting and how these speakers are set up, but that coin should be off to your left. Right. Off to your right. I'm backwards over here. So, and you should be able to hear each coin
Right,
as it gets closer.
center, left.
And the farther it is away, the softer it gets, the closer it is to you, the louder it gets, both horizontally and vertically.
Center,
And you
Right.
you speed it up.
center, right, center,
And you go through a level, and
left, center, left. Congratulations, you finished the level. Your score is...
1430.
Press spacebar to start the next level.
if I had headphones, I would do it for you guys, but I can't hear over these speakers.
Level 2.
Ready, set, go. Get them coins, boy.
And so actually, on a normal game, the obstacles don't come in until the 7th or 8th level, because, as Professor Bishop let me know, a lot of the children will play until they get to level 7 or 8, and then stop because they don't want to play with the obstacles, which I can understand because the game ends when you hit too many obstacles. I have it set where it should throw us some obstacles in this level, but just so you guys can get a feel for what they look like. But yeah, that's pretty much it. If you guys have any questions, I'll be glad to. Yeah, it's really deep. I don't believe so, because in almost any browser, as long as you're using Firefox or Chrome or basically anything other than Internet Explorer, and even even Internet Explorer to some extent. And I haven't tested too much in Internet Explorer, but about any other browser will play this. It doesn't require Flash. It doesn't require anything. It's all JavaScript and HTML5. So if it supports HTML5, you should be able to hit this page. And it seems that, like I was saying earlier, the IT guys don't want to go download some student's code, whereas this, worst case scenario, they have to install Firefox, which is widely known to be a developed piece of software. Worst case scenario. Absolutely. Any other questions?
Thank you. So my name is Rebecca Lovell, and my presentation today is about how noise caused by transient cross traffic affects the performance of rapid congestion control protocol. So in this presentation, I'll cover a little bit about what network congestion is, what current protocols do to control it, why rapid congestion control protocol is different, and finally, my initial analysis of how transient cross-traffic noise impacts rapid. And I'll also talk about what open issues need to be covered in the future. So network on the internet, users are going to have to share mediums in order to transport their data from one place to another. And like on a highway, when there are too many senders trying to send out traffic all at once, congestion can occur. And when a network router switch has more incoming traffic than it can handle, it is in a congestion state. And congestion causes many undesirable properties in a network, such as queuing delay, where packets will build up at a bottleneck router, and packet loss when the overworked routers can't handle the number of packets that they're receiving, and also the blocking of new connections. And in the extreme case, everyone is losing because a lot of traffic is going into the network, but into the congested network, and no one can achieve good throughput. So because network congestion is such an important issue, and we want to avoid it, many algorithms have been devised to control it. And the basic job of a congestion control protocol is to probe the network at different rates to find the highest rate that is admissible in the network, and then the sender can send at that rate and no higher than this rate to avoid congestion, but no lower than this rate to get the maximum throughput. So for example, in the network pictured here, the bottleneck link is 1 gigabits per second, and the sending application has no way of knowing this, so it relies on the the underlying layers in congestion control protocol to figure out how quickly to send. The predominant congestion control protocol deployed on the internet today is TCP New Reno. And in New Reno, the sender starts out by sending a very low number of packets and then waits for a round trip time, or an RTT, until ACKs for these packets come back from the receiver. And if no packet loss, it's going without me. If no packet losses have occurred, then it will increase its congestion window, or the number of packets that it will send out at any given time, and do so slowly until it detects loss, and thus can go backwards and avoid congestion. In high-speed networks, TCP New Reno can take a really long time, maybe 12,000 RTTs, to reach the available bandwidth. And so high-speed protocols have been developed, and the main advantage of high-speed protocols is that they have a more aggressive rate increase after each RTT. And as you can see, there's a significant improvement upon Neutrino. However, even they can take hundreds of RTTs to reach available bandwidth. And as the table shows, the problem just gets worse in ultra high-speed networks. So because even high-speed, the problem is even high-speed protocols are cautious about increasing their rates because of fear of overloading the network. And let's say that a protocol aggressively doubles its rate after each RTT. If the sending rate gets near but not quite to the maximum available bandwidth, then during the next RTT, the protocol would overshoot significantly, sending out maybe twice as many packets as the network can handle, and thus causing congestion and all the problems that I mentioned. So even current high-speed protocols ensure that the next rate is not too much more than the previous rate. But rapid congestion control protocol promises to reduce the available bandwidth search time by orders of magnitude. And it can search for and adapt to the available bandwidth quickly by probing for an exponentially wide range of rates within a single RTT. And so how does it do this? The first thing, as I mentioned, with a problem with aggressively increasing the number of packets you send is that you can seriously overload the network for the duration of an RTT if you overshoot, and that's bad. So to probe for much larger rates, Rapid reduces the time scale of probing by sending a much smaller number of packets for a much shorter period of time. And this way, even if you overshoot the sending rate, you overshoot the available bandwidth, then you've only sent out a small number of packets at that rate. And at worst, you're looking at some small-scale transient queue buildup. And next, Rapid doesn't wait for a whole RTT to probe for a higher sending rate. Instead, it probes for an exponentially wide range of rates by sending out, in a single RTT, by sending out each packet at a different rate. And however, the average sending rate is still going to be the most recent available bandwidth estimate. And this way, Rapid can probe for a variety of rates in a way that won't overload the network. While other protocols depend on packet losses in order to detect congestion or estimate available bandwidth, Rapid relies on interpacket gaps. The idea is that if there's some congestion in the network, that there will be some queue buildup at the bottleneck link as the routers struggle to process the packets in a timely manner, and the gaps that you originally had between the packets are going to be changed a little bit. And by using precise timestamps at both the sender and receiver, Rapid can measure the change in the gaps, and it can set the available bandwidth to the most recent rate it sent, or the first rate where gaps are starting to increase, where it suggests that there's been a change and there is congestion in the network. Therefore, Rapid can immediately reduce the speed at which it's sending and update the available bandwidth for the next probe stream. So this method is highly adaptive because it can search for both increasing and decreasing available bandwidth, and it doesn't even need to wait for a whole RTT to send out another probe stream. It just sends out what it knows and then updates when it hears about it. So the benefits of Rapid Congestion Control Protocol, it is obviously radically different. Unlike other protocols, it can search for and adapt to a variety of rates within a single RTT. It reduces the available bandwidth search time by orders of magnitude. From when beginning to send, it can converge upon the available bandwidth within 4 RTTs versus 12,000. And additionally, it's able to scale to more than terabit speeds, unlike TCP Neutrino. And it will also maintain small and transient queues at bottleneck routers. And finally, because it can adapt quickly, it's very good at adjusting to dynamically varying bandwidth. But the risk of rapid congestion control is that it relies on precisely coordinated interpacket gaps. And the underlying assumption is that gaps are only reshaped by bottleneck congestion. However, anything other than that would be considered noise that could affect how rapid performs. And there are two major sources of noise, which are not congestion at the bottleneck link, that could affect what rapid sees. So one of those things is gap destruction by non-bottleneck buffering. And basically, it's a problem because it allows for small-scale queue buildup somewhere that's not the bottleneck, and that changes the gaps that are in between packets. One source of this is burst switching, where a router will wait for several packets to come in, allow them to queue up before sending them out again. And obviously, that would destroy the precisely different gaps that you initially put in between the packets. And another cause of noise in the network is small-scale bursts in bottleneck available bandwidth. So in a network, the traffic is going up and down by small amounts constantly. But these aren't things that are affecting the long-term available bandwidth. It's just transient or bursty cross-traffic. And it's just fluctuating by small amounts. And ideally, rapid would only respond to the long-term changes and not these small bursts. So my objective this semester was to investigate how these small-scale bursts in bottleneck available bandwidth are affecting rapid's utilization of the bottleneck link in a network. And so we wanted to set up a framework by which the effects of the cross-traffic noise can be explored. And to do this, I used NS2, which is a network simulator, to set up a network topology in which a rapid sender and a cross-traffic sender share one bottleneck link. And the cross-traffic sender sends packets in on and off, again, bursts. And it will send at one steady rate while it is on, one constant bit rate while it is on. And using this network, we are able to see how the burstiness of the cross-traffic affects rapid's ability to use the bottleneck link, or to fully utilize the available bandwidth on the bottleneck link. And there are several parameters of interest within this model. First would be the cross-traffic burstiness. The cross-traffic sender is sending for a certain amount of time, T on, and not sending for the next amount of time, T off. So T on is how long the burst lasts, and T off is the time in between bursts. And also when the cross-traffic sender is sending packets, it's sending at one constant rate, which is R on. And this means that thank you. So it's sending at a constant rate, which is R on, and this means that with T on, T off, and R on, the cross-traffic sender has an average sending rate of R average over time. And in the cases I studied, I dealt with short bursts, that is where there's a short time on, which arrive frequently, and I also dealt with longer bursts where it's the same average sending rate, but bursts arrive less frequently. In addition to this, Rapid protocol also makes use of two smoothing filters. We have two different tools to use. These are the filters, they're the timescales at which Rapid smooths the available bandwidth readings that it makes. So these parameters specify how long it takes Rapid to respond to a change in the network. And the parameter tau, which is the first thing that you see, specifies how long it takes Rapid to adapt to an increase in the available bandwidth. So once Rapid sees that there is more space that it can take up, once it detects this, it would take tau time units to ramp up and converge upon the available bandwidth that it can achieve. Similarly, the parameter eta specifies how long it takes rapid to ramp down or to converge to a lower sending rate. And it can be shown that tau should always be more than eta for stability reasons. That is, rapid should take longer to use excess available bandwidth than it does to respond to a decrease in available bandwidth. In my research, I looked at two scenarios that are affected by these parameters in different ways. So in the first case, both T on and T off are larger than tau and eta. And this means that rapid has enough time to detect the change in available bandwidth and to converge upon a new sending rate. And let's see. When the cross-traffic bursts, then rapid will detect. This is the cross-traffic going on and off and on and off. And an RTT time later, rapid will detect the change. To ramp up, it will take tau time units to reach the new available bandwidth, and to ramp down after it detects that the burst has occurred, it will take eta time units. And so this is basically meaning that traffic is bursty at large time scales, and rapid has plenty of time. Every time there is a burst in cross-traffic, rapid loses some of its throughput because it takes more time to ramp up or increase sending rate than to ramp down. And the greater the difference between tau and eta, the greater the difference between the time it takes you to ramp up to full speed versus how long it takes you to go down to the lower speed, the less time you're going to be able to send packets even though you could. So the utilization is the loss of the utilization would be expected to be proportional to the constant tau minus eta. And additionally, rapid will have to ramp up or ramp down every time there is a cross-traffic burst. So as bursts become more frequent, that is, T-on gets smaller, then rapid will lose more throughput and utilization and go down. So this equation can be derived, and it has, the loss is proportional to both the frequency, 1 over T-on, and the quantity tau minus eta. And experimental results confirm that this is on the right track. I ran experiments where T-on and T-off are fixed and tau minus eta varies, and this is the theoretical curve and the experimental in NS2 curve, and it shows that we're on the right track. But there are still there's an offset between the theoretical curve and the experimental results, and this suggests that there are additional parameters at play which will need to be incorporated. And additionally, when plotting against T-on, when holding tau minus eta constant, and it does not match the theoretical results. So this is another confirmation that there are more things to look at in the future. And especially at higher frequencies, this is not, the theoretical result is not what shows up. So in the second case that I looked at, T-on is less than eta and T-off is less than tau. And basically, this means that rapid does not have enough time after it detects a change in the available bandwidth to fully ramp up or ramp down to the speeds that it can get to. And analysis of this situation is more complex because it depends on the speeds which rapid has the opportunity to ramp up or ramp down to, which which depends on how much time it has. And this in turn depends on how much time rapid has to ramp up compared to how long cross-traffic bursts last before they disappear. And the theoretical equation is similarly more complex. It shows that loss is proportional to tau minus eta, but also that the other factors of how long it has to ramp up and how long it has to ramp down are also in play. And so shorter, more frequent bursts seem to have more effect, more interesting impact on rapid's performance than longer and less frequent bursts of noise. And again, I ran several experiments on the model network using constant values for the cross-traffic bursts and varying tau minus eta. And again, it shows that we're on the right track, but there are still parameters which I need to dig deeper into to find what things need to be incorporated into the theoretical analysis. And again, at least this curve goes in the right direction. That's nice. But there's more to be done. And utilization in the theoretical curve is crossing 1, which is not good. That's unstable and would cause congestion. So there are more things to consider when doing this. So the open concerns that are left, this is not a complete analysis. I'm just at the beginning of the investigation and we'll need to dig deeper. And the ultimate goal of this research is to figure out how to properly configure rapid to work in a realistic network environment. And the concerns which need to be addressed are matching the theoretical and experimental results. So digging deeper into what's going on and investigating the effect of other parameters such as probe stream length and number of packets sent out in a probe stream to understand how they affect rapid. Additionally, this is a very controlled model, and while it's a good way to get into looking at how these things are affecting the congestion control protocol, we'd also want to look at how noise in less controlled environments will impact the protocol. And additionally, regarding noise, there's the other major cause of noise, which is non-bottleneck buffering, where something like a router is holding things up even though there's no change in available bandwidth. So if you're interested in learning more about Rapid, you can look at rapid.web.unc.edu. And the site has a number of resources, including links to papers, which discuss it in more detail. Thank you.
And yeah, so I will be in graduate school here. I'm still deciding on what field to go into, but somewhere in biomedical engineering. So my project was a low-cost robotic platform for medical robotics research. This started as a project for a fellowship that I got last summer in BME, and it was transformed into my honors thesis. So we'll start off with robotics in general. As you can see, this is just an industrial robot. You've all seen them before. And the reason for robotics is because they provide speed, precision, accuracy, the ability to perform complex procedures, and most importantly, the ability to perform automated procedures. So for example, when you're making a car, it's a very standard car, very standard procedure. You either screw in a screw, you weld a joint, etc. And so the reason for having these robots is to perform these tasks. Now, when you go into surgical robotics, you also see that there's speed, precision, accuracy, and the ability to perform complex procedures using these surgical robots. But the one thing that we're missing is automation. And the reason that we need automation is for example, when a doctor is performing surgery, surgery takes a long time to do. Surgery is fairly complicated. And the ability to automate some of these procedures would relieve some of that stress from the surgeon. And by doing so, we would be moving forward in the current laparoscopic procedures that we have here. This is the Da Vinci system. I'll talk more about that later. But what we would want is to automate procedures that aren't specifically complicated to do, and standard procedures, once again, just like welding a joint or screwing a screw. All right, so the procedures that we're going to be talking about are for laparoscopic surgery, minimally invasive surgery. On the right here is the doctor and what is actually going on in the body, or actually this is just an example of the human body. And a laparoscopic surgery is based on a single incision for each instrument. So the abdomen is inflated with CO2 to create a workspace environment inside the body. And a tool is inserted into each incision. Now the point is that, for example, if you don't need to do any major surgery and you just need to create a suture or cut off a piece of skin, you don't need to cut open the body. All you can do is just cut a little hole. And laparoscopic surgery has been around for many decades. This is nothing new. What is new, on the other hand, is using a robot to control the laparoscopic tool. Now, for laparoscopic surgery, you'd need at least 2 people. So 2 arms and at least 1 more person holding an endoscopic camera, so the surgeon can actually see what's going on. And the thing that we're gaining here with the Da Vinci system is that one surgeon can be seated comfortably at a different location, and he can control all of these tools, which are interchangeable. You can have grippers, scalpels, etc. And you can all do that from one platform, and everything can be controlled by this one surgeon. And things like vibrations due to just hand motion, they're all filtered out. However, it is all teleoperated. There is nothing that the robot does by itself aside from minor filtering or providing simplistic motion. So the goal is to automate these standard motions. Once again, this is nothing for major surgery. This is for making a suture once you're done with surgery, sewing the person up. And the way to do that is to characterize a 3D environment inside the body. So the one thing that's different between a factory machine and the machine that we're working with here is that everything in the factory is standardized. Now, if you put in a screw in location X, when you put in the next car, the screw is still going to go in location X. When you put in a human body, the heart is in one location. When you put the next person on, the heart's going to be in a different position. And so the one thing that we have to do is add vision to the process. And the way to do that is to reconstruct your environment, your working environment, the body, before you can do any of the automation. And this is an example of a 3D reconstruction of a tumor. Now, this is an example of real-time reconstruction. This is a car going down a street, right and left view cameras. You have sensors on each side, and it's reconstructing as it's moving along. Now, imagine being able to do that inside the body. Now, instead of having an endoscopic camera with a stereoscopic attachment, you can have the robot itself move in a predefined algorithm that would create this 3D reconstruction inside the body in real time and able to then perform automated procedures, or at least allow the operator to see in 3D space what's going on at the moment. This is an example of a knot tying technique. So this is done, once again, also at UNC. And this robot is performing a task that is done by learning. It's a different procedure. You don't have to worry about that now. But it's a fairly complicated task, as you can see. But the thing is, we have the techniques to be able to do that. Now, this is stationary. Nothing's moving. There's no heartbeat. The body's not moving around. But to be able to do something like this inside the body, you'd have to create this 3D reconstruction. You have to know where the suture is. You have to know where the body is. You have to know where the skin is, where the incision is. And at the moment, this does not have any information about that. It's just doing a essentially pre-programmed technique. So the goal is to create a low-cost robotic test bed to evaluate motion planning algorithms that exist or will exist in the future for minimally invasive surgery. And before we started, we had some design requirements. The first design requirement is that this had to have 6 degrees of freedom. The Da Vinci system had 6 degrees of freedom. It actually had more in a different wrist rotation, but at the minimal requirement here was 6 degrees of freedom. It had to mimic a laparoscopic instrument. Now, once again, this is for minimally invasive laparoscopic surgery, so it both had to mimic the instrument by insertion, and it also had to take an instrument and be able to control it. And it also had to be, of course, low cost. And this is a visualization of just the general big picture. So we have the tool, we have the end effector, which is a gripper or a scalpel or anything that you put on the end of the endoscope, or end of the tube that is being inserted. We have the insertion point. Now this point is stable. This is the goal of, this is the basis of laparoscopic surgery. You have one incision point. This point cannot move. You have your skin surface, which is inflated, and you have a way to insert it in and out. You have a way to move it back and forth, tilt it, rotate it, et cetera, to add 6 degrees of freedom. And a way to look back on the real picture, you can see that sort of looks the same. And the outline of my talk, I'm going to go through, which I just went through the introduction. I'll talk about the related work that inspired this design and this project. I'll talk about the mechanical design. I'll briefly cover the kinematics and the software. And I'll show you some videos that actually show the robot in progress. And I'll talk about the future work. So related work. This is based on the intuitive surgical Da Vinci system, as we talked about before. It's a 6 degree of freedom, minimally invasive commercial surgical robot. It's very expensive. UNC has 4 of them. And the reason that we want this low-cost test bed is because we can't just play around with a $1.3 million system. And it's both in use, and no one's going to allow us to do that. So that was the first thing that inspired us to create this. Now, this is another commercial robot. It is a light endoscopic robot, so it's not a surgical robot. What it does is provides the user, or the surgeon, with the camera attachment. And this is only 3 degrees of freedom. The way this works is pretty simple. You have the main rotation, which rotates around the main axis, so you can create the cone shape inside. You have a spring that is being pulled by a servo motor, so you have the in and out motion here. And you have the tilt caused by this motion, which causes the tilt and the cone angle, essentially. So this design is what inspired the current robot design that we have right now. And another design that we looked at is the Delta robot. If any of you know the Delta robot, it's used a lot in manufacturing. It's really known for high speed. So if you wanted to put something on a conveyor belt, move it back and forth, this is the robot that you would use. So this is the SolidWorks model of what would have 6 degrees of freedom without the end attachment. But the problem with this design is, as you can see, the tube has a CV joint. And what the point of a CV joint is you have a rotation in one axis, and it provides a rotation in the other axis. And there's no way to actually insert a endoscopic tool inside that tube. So this design was thrown out, but we played around with it for a little bit. So the mechanical design. The big picture is, as once again, we needed 6 degrees of freedom. It had to mimic a laparoscopic tool, and it had to position a real laparoscopic tool. So what we decided to do is use a linear actuator to move this rod in and out, have a turntable that would cause the maximum axial rotation, have some way to turn the rod to minimal axial rotation. You have 2 end effectors, or 2 degrees of freedom in the end effector, and some way to tilt the linear actuator. And so the final version is this. This is a SolidWorks model. As you can see, from the underside, we'll start from the underside. So this motor right here turns a band, which turns this axle and causes the major axial rotation, which turns the entire thing. This point right here is the stable point, which mimics the insertion point of the laparoscopic tool. The linear actuator right here causes the in and out motion. The minor axial rotation about this point, or about the rod, the axis, is caused by the servo with this gear system. The tilt is caused by this gearbox using a very powerful servo, because the linear actuator arm is actually quite heavy. That was one of the problems that I'll talk about later. And the end effector is shown here. And this thing was added in the end. This is a damping system, which I'll discuss with one of the challenges. But as this arm is very heavy, you cause vibrations just in general motion. And also the fact that we're using gears, there's backlash in gears when you change direction, which causes error, and a spring of constant force in one of the directions prevents that. So going over the degrees of freedom, which more visual here, you have your first one, the in and out motion. The second one causes the tilt. The third one causes the major axial rotation. Fourth one, minor axial rotation. Fifth one is the wrist motion. And the sixth one, if there was a stereoscopic camera, it would move back and forth. But in this case, it's just a gripper attachment. The end effector. The end effector is what goes on the end of the rod. And this is interchangeable. And the current design right here takes in a servo motor, which rotates the wrist, And then this current attachment is just a gripper. If you remove the gripper, this hole aligns with the rod, and we're able to insert a pencil. And this pencil is used for testing to see if it can stay on a plane and perform various techniques such as curves, straight lines, etc. And here's a picture of the current system. And lots of more wires, obviously, than the model that we've seen before. It is on an 80-20 stand. Once again, here's the linear actuator arm. I have better images. This servo, this giant servo, is the one that causes the major axial rotation. And all of the parts above this plate right here were machined. I machined in the machine shop last summer. And these parts are the parts that had to be made out of 6061 aluminum because there's a lot of stress on it. And some parts, like for example, this plate, which has a very unique shape, and we went through many, many different designs, I made on a simple laser cutter out of acrylic, pretty thick acrylic. So it's not the best thing to use, but considering a plate like this would take 60, 70 hours to machine, it's easier to just use pre-manufactured equipment. These right here I made on the FDM, which is essentially a 3D laser printer. And this is made out of hard plastic, ABS plastic. And the rest is 6061 aluminum. This is aluminum, and there is a steel and brass gear system in the gearbox, once again, because the torque is very high. It's around 600 ounce-inches. And this plate right here is also made out of acrylic, and the rest of the electronics, just obviously electronics, and this is an 80-20 frame that holds everything stable. Brass, because the servos that we bought are from Servo City, and the only hubs that they provide are made of brass. Yeah, I actually agree brass is not the best to use because steel on brass wears the brass down very quickly, and we actually have a problem with that. But unfortunately, the cheapest that I could get, since this is a prototype, sort of a proof of concept, the brass ones are the cheapest that Servo City provided. So the challenges that we faced. The original design actually had the servo on the inside. This uses a turntable, something that you use, for example, a TV, to spin the TV around. And I assumed that the inside surface of the turntable would be perfectly round. That was a very bad assumption. It was cut not even remotely close to being round, and after a quarter of a turn, the gear would pop off, essentially, because it was round. So that had to be moved to the side. The other part, which I didn't even think about when I was making this, was it wasn't stable in the XY plane. This attachment piece not only holds the spring and the controller, but also prevents the rotation, this type of rotation around, because the linear actuator only provides force up and down. It doesn't stop anything from just twisting it. And if you have these 2 points of contact, it's unstable in that direction. And then the linear actuator arm also vibrated. The vibration is still there, obviously, because we're looking at a pretty big arm on a very, very small point. And you have a really, really high torque on the outside, especially when the arm is all the way out. And so after every motion, it would go to the exact position. It was fairly accurate in that, but it would still vibrate with every motion. And by putting a spring, you both got rid of the backlash in the gears, and you reduce the vibration. There's still some vibration, but it's very minimal. And that was one of the reasons why having a robotic platform is useful, because when you're doing this just in a simulation, you don't take into account some of these things, some of these real-world errors that exist. And I'll briefly touch on the kinematics. So going back to the original design, this purple area is the workspace. And the workspace just being defined as where can we position our gripper to be. And so it's fairly simple, I guess, to analyze. You have, if you push the actuator all the way in, you're going to create this hemisphere. The cone is caused by the tilt in the arm right here. And these little ridges on the end are mainly due to the end effector moving around. And this area right here is also caused by the end effector having a length other than 0, so you don't have a perfect cone. But this is essentially what the workspace is, and you can clearly see that this fits inside of a human body, actually is larger than a human body. So it'll definitely hit all the points that we're looking for. And the forward kinematics are as follows. And the forward kinematics are essentially, if I were to dictate every single angle and position, where's the end effector going to end up? So if this were angle phi 1, this is length alpha 1, etc., where is this going to end up? And I broke this down into point P0 and P1. P0 being where is the end of the rod going to be located, and P1 where is the end effector going to be located. Since the end effector is variable, it has its own variable system. Oh, no, cancel that. I think my computer is resetting itself. I have it on a flash drive. Let's pull that up on a flash drive. Murphy's Law, like you said. I think I should switch it to Max. Work side. Okay. Yep, it reset itself.
Any questions so far?
Okay. Okay, and we're back. And point P1 is dictated by the following formulas. And essentially that is 3D geometry. Now, the next one is, the more useful one is the inverse kinematics. And inverse kinematics is, if I were to go to point XYZ, where do I have to position my arm? Where do I have to position all of these angles to get to that point? And you do inverse kinematics daily. When you eat cereal, for example, you bring your spoon up to your mouth. You don't think about the angles of your joints. That's essentially what inverse kinematics is. And it is a lot more complicated because you have more than one position in your hand to cause the end effector or your spoon to be in your mouth. And this is essentially what you need to provide the necessary, or to be able to run these algorithms. Okay, and the software used was, or not the software, this is the servo controller, the Fidget's 1061. This is what ran all of the servos. It can run 8 servos and has a resolution of 125 steps per degree, so it's accurate to 0.008 degrees. Obviously, the servos that we used weren't that high-tech, so they're not that accurate, but it can provide that accuracy. And Java was chosen as the language to create the API for this. So here are some evaluation videos. This is one of the earlier tasks. This has a gripper, and it's picking up this piece of foam. And the test here was to use all of the motors at once and to be able to pick up this device, which wasn't necessary, but it was a test of all of the servos at once. It picked up the piece of foam. And the next one was drawing a straight line. So the end effector was replaced by a pencil, and the pencil was pre-programmed to draw a straight line on this piece of paper. And this was using 3 of the servos at once. The first one was the tilt, the second one was the wrist, and the third one was the insertion depth. And all 3 had to be incorporated to keep the pencil both level and perpendicular to the paper. And in this way, it's also possible to calculate the error by looking at, or qualitatively calculate the error by looking at the thickness or the darkness of the band starting and ending. And as you can see, it's getting lighter at the end as either the pencil is being worn down, which is a possible explanation, or that it's coming a little bit off the paper. And the next evaluation is checking precision. So we're going to redraw the same exact line and rerun the program again.
Now?
And when you look at this, there is pretty much no noticeable difference. It followed the line almost exactly. And one of the things that you may have noticed is that it's jerky when it's moving. And the reason for that has nothing to do with the mechanics. It's mainly the software. The problem is you have 3 joints that are being actuated, and they need to be actuated simultaneously. So when you're moving something to keep it perpendicular, you're moving all of your joints. And what this is doing, mainly due to the fact that we're using the servo controller, which is pretty inexpensive. It was less than $100. It's sending out the signals non-simultaneously, asynchronously. So you're moving the first joint, second joint, third joint, and correcting for that. And the way I do that, I also made sure that, to not create anything strange, I continuously ran a check to see if the servo was moving. So you send in the first execution, and then you check to see if the servo is moving. Once the servo stops moving, you send in your second command, third command. Once that's done, you move on to the next step. And so that's the reason for the jerkiness. And if we were to create those, have a parallel command being sent out, then all of that jerkiness would be just one smooth motion. And the conclusion and future work, I'd like to first, I guess, step back and say how this is different from a clinical robot. This uses a position control versus a force control in PID system. A position control is something that is a fairly basic system where you say, go to this position, and it moves to that position, regardless of whether or not something is going to be blocking it. So if I were to say, go down below that pencil, the paper, it would go through the paper. Now, a force controller, a PID control feedback system, which is something that the DaVinci has, is if there's something there, it would stop. Or if there is an error, it would correct for that error. And that's something that we're going to be adding in the future. Also, it's using non-FDA approved materials. You can't use brass and 6061 aluminum and open gears and oil in the human body. And it uses a pretty large end effector. It's not something that would fit inside the body. Once again, this is for testing purposes. And quick view of the cost, it was about $1,800 for everything. And this included prototyping, so equipment that had to be thrown out due to just being part of the prototype system. So the future work would be to smooth the motions using a PID controller and also buying a better servo controller. The next step would be to automate have an automatic calibration using magnetic encoders, and that would be part of the feedback system. As in every joint would have an encoder that would tell the position and give a feedback back to the program. Also, we would test the stereoscopic hammer attachments to be able to start a 3D, or at least a basic 3D reconstruction algorithm, and potentially build another robot to perform surgical tasks such as tying a knot or holding up a flap of skin and cutting it off. And then later on, we would use this robotic platform to evaluate new motion planning algorithms. And these are the acknowledgements. Any questions? Yes? Yeah. So the material was acrylic. I was looking for something very quick and easy to fix. The reason for the bridge, mainly so there's something supports. I don't actually need the second wall. I just needed the first wall to hold the spring. The bridge is just so it keeps it stable. It's not the best looking thing. It also actually helps keep the wires out of the way. What's not shown is, if you remember in the picture, there's a little dowel rod that holds all the wires out of the way. That's another thing to figure out.
The bridge is not damping element, it's just support.
Yes, it's support. Yeah, the spring, which unfortunately SolidWorks could not let me allow the spring. The spring that goes from here to here is the damping. The springs provide a constant force. Yeah. They prevent the vibration. They lower the vibration amplitude. So they don't prevent it altogether, but they lower the amplitude of the vibration. No, they don't literally dampen. Oh, thank you.
I hope everyone's been enjoying the presentation so far. This is a really exciting day for me. It's the first time I've actually tied a tie. My research is on modeling essential tremors. And I've been doing this under the direction and supervision of Dr. Greg Welch, who's just been really encouraging and has a really nifty vision for all this. And I'll get a chance to talk about that. We've also been working with Professor Richard Murrow, who's a neurologist at the UNC neurology department. And we've been trying to make a teaching tool for him, and he's been a big help with what he's able to tell us and point us to other resources. We're also working with Dr. Oleg Favreau, who works with UNC Biomedical Engineering. And his research specialty actually is working with computational and functional organization of neurons. And that's really relevant to what we're doing. What are we doing? I'm going to explain that in the next slide. So essential tremor is the most common tremor. It's actually 10 times as common as Parkinson's. What are the differences between essential tremor and Parkinson's? Parkinson's you see a lot when people are more at rest, when their hands are at bay. While essential tremor, you see that more while people are active and engaged in their daily activities. Another difference is in Parkinson's, you don't really see too much tremor with the head or the voice. In essential tremors, though, you see that it can really affect the voice, which you see with a shaking voice. It affects the head, which you see with a nodding head. And it can also affect the legs. And you really see essential tremor manifest itself in severe involuntary shaking. I'm going to show you a video of that real soon. But before I do that, essential tremor starts out really slow. You don't notice it often. Most people actually who have essential tremor find out when they're in their mid-ages, between 40 to 50, that they have essential tremor, and it gets progressively worse. As I said before, these tremors, they manifest in movement. When you're trying to write something, you can really see the tremor acting. And obviously, with something like essential tremor, you're going to see that it has a lot of effect in your social life. It could have a lot of emotional harm. Stress actually makes the tremor even worse. It's just a bad cycle. I'm going to show you a short YouTube clip of someone with essential tremor. And you can see that they're trying to use their hands to write, but the essential tremor is really coming in there. So how do you cure essential tremor? Well, the big problem is we don't really know the cause of the tremor. We don't know exactly what's going on in the brain that is causing this tremor to be out there. We know that genes play a role. You're more likely to have essential tremor if members in your family have had essential tremor. So that's something, but we really don't know what's going on. Most people who have essential tremor don't opt for treatment. A lot of essential tremor is smaller and doesn't interfere as much, but obviously there are severe cases of essential tremor, which we're hoping that this research will address. There are medications, which is generally the first step that people take to, the first serious step that people take to addressing this. But the medications themselves aren't always effective. And if not medications, what's the next step? There's something really neat called deep brain stimulation. Now, deep brain stimulation, you have three components. You have a implanted pulse generator, and this pulse generator is connected to a lead that consists of 4 electrodes in the brain, which then there's an extension wire connecting the leads, again, to the pulse generator. What the pulse generator does is it sends pulses to interfere with the brain activity that's going on. This is all done with anesthesia, by the way. We believe that the problem that's going on in the brain is in the thalamus area, and that's usually where these electrodes are located. Deep brain stimulation is really nice. It's really good. It's made a lot of differences in a lot of people's lives. But it's also not perfect and has a lot of problems. One of which is actually creating, when the neurologist tries to pick out the settings for this pacemaker and these electrodes, they do so qualitatively instead of quantitatively. And as a consequence of that, you don't get extremely precise, accurate systems that work for a long period of time. And you actually see that these systems get less and less effective over time, to the point where they sometimes stop working or have to be run on in certain intervals. So you'd run them on for 2 hours, pause them for 2 hours, then run them again for 2 more hours. And that obviously puts a huge restriction in what you can do. The 2 hours that it's not running on, you can't write or do stuff when the tremor really kicks in. That's a big problem, and that's where actually this research fits in. Our goal is ultimately to have a quantitative system to address this and really improve on deep brain stimulation. Our short-term goal for now is to have a teaching model for Dr. Murrow, who is, again, the neurologist at UNC hospitals. And Dr. Murrow is interested in having a teaching tool, a model that he can use to teach about essential tremors to his students and learn himself more about it. Our medium-term goal is to have a quantitative system for DBS adjustment, just what I was talking about before. Have a way to measure these tremors in a more quantitative fashion and also address them in a quantitative fashion, and have a model that can reflect adjustments in the settings for these electrodes. Our long-term goal is to have an autonomous active system for tremor control. And Dr. Welch's idea was to have, say, a watch on your hand, and if the tremor starts acting up, it detects that and starts creating adjustments, changing variables and parameters inside the pacemaker unit or the control unit. And that's our long-term goal. I'm going to be talking today about our short-term goal. There's a lot of progress still to be made in all these, so this is a work in progress, but there's definitely been some nice progress, and I'll be talking about that. So how do we go about modeling neurons with essential tremors? A big problem, as I mentioned before, is no one really knows what's up. No one really knows what's going on. And there's really not much literature about it. There is some literature, though, which is a good news, a good starting point to have conversations with Dr. Murrow and Dr. Favorab. And this literature is kind of the building block of our research. And the idea that's out there right now is that you have unstable circuits of neurons in areas of the brain like the thalamus. And these neurons are unstable and they're hyperactive and they're oscillating and doing crazy stuff. You get this increased frequency of oscillations, which then results in tremor. A normal brain neuron circuit does not oscillate as much. And when you see these increased oscillations, so that's a sign right there that manifests itself in tremor-like limb motion. I'm going to start off with trying to explain a neuron, the building block for all of this. I was thinking about how to explain this, and I'm going to try to use an analogy between me and my dad. Say I do something that makes my dad a little upset. His temper goes up a little bit, but comes down. And you see that, is there a laser pointer here? You see that right over there? The anger going up, anger coming down, anger going up, anger coming down. Eventually, at some point, I've done this before, unfortunately, I anger him too much in a short period of time, and it passes a threshold, and that causes him to fire a lecture. And so essentially what you're seeing is you're seeing presynaptic neurons, which are the neurons firing signals to their to other neurons. They're firing and stimulating this neuron. And if enough stimulations happen in a short enough period of time, the neuron decides to fire an action potential, which in my analogy was my dad shouting at me. And you see that at the far end over there when it just spikes up and then comes down. What's going on while all this is happening? You have an interplay of calcium, potassium, and sodium just coming in and out of the neuron. Calcium comes in. Calcium plays a role. I'll get to that in the next few slides. Sodium is really what kicks up the neuron, the entry of sodium beyond a certain threshold voltage, and that causes an action potential to be fired. Potassium then causes action potential to come down. The graph is cut off, but what ends up happening is once you get really high, you come down all the way back to resting potential. Resting potential is around negative 65 millivolts. I know that means nothing really, but resting potential comes about because of chemical and electrical gradients of ions. And that's just the number that they arrive to. And it's just something to keep in mind as I show you some more graphs. Let's continue. The key piece to modeling a circuit with essential tremors is something called the low threshold calcium current. And this works through something called post-inhibitory rebound. And I won't get into all the details, but essentially what happens is there's an entry of calcium neurons that causes a neuron, there's an entry of calcium ions that causes a neuron to get really, really excited and fire an action potential. And this happens when the opposite of what I talked about before, instead of me making my dad angry, I make him happier and happier, and for some reason, after I stop making him happier, he decides to fire a sermon at me. So it's kind of a reverse effect. It's really interesting where instead of having to excite a neuron to get an action potential, you can inhibit a neuron, and then after releasing your inhibition, you can allow for an action potential. And what we believe is this is the mechanism behind what we see with essential tremor. And this current can be modified by parameters. And when this current is high, you can expect to see high oscillations. Originally, Dr. Murrow wanted a 2-neuron model, which makes a lot of assumptions and kind of simplifies things. But we do have that for him. In the 2-neuron model, what you see is neuron number 1 and neuron number 2. Neuron number 1 starts inhibiting neuron number 2. And when it releases its inhibition, neuron number 2 decides to start firing. And that just cycles. And you see alternating bursts of impulses in these neurons. And it's these oscillations right there that cause the tremor. That's one theory, at least. So that's really nifty, but we also want a model that's more realistic, and that's the next stage of all this. I guess I'm just going to show really quickly the results of our simpler model, which is it's extremely predictable because you just have 2 neurons. There's not too much complexity in that. This right here is resting potential. And you can see that when this neuron is firing, the neuron on the top is firing, this neuron is being inhibited, which means its membrane potential is coming down a little bit. The moment the first one stops firing, though, the second one starts to pick it up. So that's when that's really how these oscillations come to play. One fires, while one is firing, the other is not firing. Then that one starts to fire, and they just alternate back and forth. This is the first stage of our modeling this essential tremor, and we have a more complex model now. But before I continue and introduce the more complex model, the one parameter here that we're really trying to mess with, because we believe it's really important to modeling essential tremor, is the low threshold calcium current. And here, I have it set to one parameter, and the second one, I've multiplied that by a factor, and you can see how there is a lot more bursting. What does bursting mean? Well, that's effectively after my dad shouts at me, he continues for a while before he stops down. So you see these action potentials over and over for a brief period of time, and you can see that the second part of this graph corresponds with when an action potential is shut out, when the membrane voltage passes the threshold. And you can see that they gradually decrease, the time intervals between them gradually increase until the neuron cools down and is no longer firing any action potentials. So just to recap that really quickly, when we increase the low threshold calcium current, you see the oscillations are really playing a bigger role. You see stronger oscillations. So the more realistic model takes into account that there are a lot more neurons than two at game. It also takes into account that you don't really see predictable results in the actual results that you see when Dr. Murr is actually messing with people who have essential tremor. The realistic model, you see some randomness. This is not just randomness. It's randomness that comes from the deterministic complexity of the model. You see that instead of the oscillations being evenly spaced out, sometimes you have big spacing, sometimes the spacing gets smaller. You just see the model being more realistic. And the next step to this is to make the model even more realistic and to have it fit an even better architecture and to have even more neurons in it and to find a way to integrate this display into the kind of display that Dr. Murr wants. And the awesome part of that is we're probably just under a month away from that. So we're really close and kicking into high gear right now. The imminent goal is for me to work over summer on this and take care of those short-term goals. Just have really a complete display, a model for Dr. Murr that we can be confident in. We can be confident so that he can actually teach other people with this model. And then take the next step, go into tremor control, see how to use this model. We have some ideas already, how to use this model and integrate that with deep brain stimulation so we can actually come up with a quantitative system to reduce these tremors. And that's really exciting. I just really love this research. There's, I think, a lot of potential just in the short run to help out Dr. Murrow and make a difference just in the local Carolina community. And a lot of potential, I think, to make an improvement in the lives of people with essential tremors. It's exciting, very challenging at times, enlightening. I've learned a lot. Just final acknowledgement, this work is supported by Gary Bishop. We're at a trust fund called the Sullivan Foundation.
Okay, so I'm Caitlin Lucy, and I worked on a project called the Bathysphere. The Bathysphere was created for the Chat Festival, which is a collaboration between several local universities. UNC and State were involved. I think Duke was involved too. But it was hosted by UNC. It was
coordinated by the Institute for the Arts and Humanities, whose goal is to promote collaboration across the disciplines. As you can see by the name of the festival, Collaboration, Humanities, Arts, and Technologies. So it was a week-long event, and what we created was an interactive art installation for this festival that was open at various times throughout the week. So on the left we have Francesca Talenti. She's from UNC's Communications Department. She was the artistic lead on the project. And then on the right we have Greg Welch. I also worked with him from our own computer science department. He was the technical lead on the project. So our installation was hosted in Girard Hall, which you can see on the left. It's near Memorial Hall. You've probably walked past it at some point. On the right you have the interior of the building. So we took out the chairs and we actually hung screens on the left and right. Running down the sides, those are balconies, and we hung screens from those balconies that we projected on them. So we projected an underwater world onto the interior of the building. We projected on the side screens, the back wall, and the floor. So if you think of this room as Girard Hall, only slightly more rectangular in this direction, you would come in the back, and we would be projecting on these sides and the rear wall and also on the floor. So the audience would stand in the middle and be surrounded by the underwater scene. So we had 3 different animated creatures that lived in this world, and each creature was controlled by a physical object that people could move around. So we had the umbrella that controlled the manta ray, as you can see in that picture. No, I don't think that's him. And then we had a wireframe ball, which controlled an octopus, which is in the upper right. And then we had a fishing pole that controlled the fish, school of fish. So the audience could stand in the middle and move the objects around, and they would see the sea creatures follow the movements of the objects. And we also included an audio component. So you'd be standing in the middle, and you'd be surrounded also by this like subtle roar of the ocean. But as you picked up each object, you could hear a different melody played by each animal. And so I'm going to show you a quick video that we filmed during testing just to give you sort of an idea of what this looks like. I'm going to turn the lights down because it's sort of a dark video. Sorry. Okay. Ooh, I forgot the audio. Where's the... There you go. So let me play that one more time so you can hear the sounds. We've got the sounds in both of them. Put that one down. When you put down the object, it doesn't make the sound. But when you pick it back up, you can see how the octopus follows the movements of the ball. So I'm going to give you an overview of how we accomplished this. First, I'm going to talk about how we handled the display, and then cover the motion capture elements, and then the graphics, and then talk about the system as a whole. So first, the displays. Our goal here was really to cover as much of the building in imagery as possible. So we chose projectors as really the best option for us. We had one projector for each of the side walls. You can see the orange and the blue in the picture. And then we had one for the back wall, that's the purple, and one for the floor, which is green. If you notice in the picture the gray areas, that's actually the balcony. Girard Hall has that upper balcony I mentioned before. So we had these really tall, they're about this tall, adjustable wooden mounts that we put the projectors on in the balcony. So this allowed us to, they were up really high and it aimed down but over the heads of the audience. So this helped keep the shadows of the audience members out of our imagery. And it was also nice because they were up in the balcony out of the way. Audience members weren't allowed up there, so you didn't have people like knocking into things. So because we had the projectors at such an extreme angle, we had this problem called keystoning. So because the surface was closer to the projector at the top than it was at the bottom, we would get an image like the one on the left. But luckily the projectors had built-in keystone correction, so we were able to get a corrected image like the one on the right. So another issue we ran into, the dimensions of the imagery we wanted to project and the dimensions of the surface we were projecting onto weren't the same. So the way we fixed that, we created physical masks, the mask being sort of square part here. We didn't use this exact kind, but we put a mask on the lens of the projectors so that the imagery would only show up where we wanted it to. And the nice thing about these is that having the edge so close to the lens, it's out of focus, so it creates a nice soft edge that blends nicely with the other imagery. So now we're going to cover the motion tracking. So I showed you this picture before, but you might not have noticed the little silver dots on the umbrella. You can see them here. There are 4 of them, I think, over here. So those are used with the OptiTrack optical motion tracking system. So the OptiTrack system uses cameras. I have one here. They're pretty small. This one's just a different color, but otherwise the same. And there's a ring of lights around the lens, and those emit infrared light. So the retroreflective markers reflect that light directly back at the camera lens. So then the camera can take 2-dimensional images, but the images have bright spots where the markers are. So when you have cameras with overlapping fields of view, you can compute the 3-dimensional position of the markers. And having as many cameras as possible, in our case we had 12, means that even if something or someone is in the way of one of the cameras, you still have enough images to compute the position of the object. Now, you'll also notice we have multiple markers on each of the objects. You need multiple markers to compute the orientation of the object. And in order for the system to recognize several markers on the object, those markers have to stay at the same relative distance. So like, we have the fishing pole, and we have markers here, but we don't have one at the end because the end bends, and then it wouldn't be able to see it as a single object. And the same with the umbrella. You can't open and close the umbrella because that changes the distance between the markers, and it doesn't know that it's the same object. So the graphics. So we have models of these characters were created by one of the artists on our project, and those were created in Maya, but we imported them into Unity, which is where we modeled the environment. We also used it to render our scene. And Unity is a really cool game development tool that lent itself really nicely to a lot of the stuff we were trying to do. Our project had a lot of similarities to the video game sorts of things. And it had a lot of features that helped us really put our system together that I'm going to get to in a minute when we go through the overview. So you can divide the system into 3 parts. There's the sort of physical area where you have the objects that you're tracking in the cameras and the audience members. Then you have the virtual, you have the models and the environment and what's happening in the computer. And then you have this sort of combination where we project images from the virtual back into the physical. So sort of walk through this. So what happens when you move the ball? Well, the light from the camera bounces off the markers on the ball and goes back to the camera. And this allows the system to determine the position and the orientation of the ball. That allows the OptiTrack system to determine the position and orientation. So Unity needs to get the latest position information from the OptiTrack system, and it does that using a simple CDLL. So this information updates the position and the orientation of the model within the environment. So at this point, we've updated the position of the model on one machine, on the server, but we also need to update it on the 4 different client machines that are powering each of the 4 different projectors. We can't power 4 projectors from one computer. Unity allows us to use distributed state networking. So each client has a copy of the state, has a copy of the environment. So we send just the updated position and orientation of the objects. And by sending just the parts that have changed, rather than the entire state, we drastically minimize the amount of information that we're sending over the network, and it helped a lot with the speed. So I'm going to show you a video of our final result. This was filmed during the festival with actual audience members. I'm sure my audio is working this time.
So
from a lot of sources that we'd like to acknowledge. And then we'd also like to say thanks to all the team members involved in the project. As you can see, we had a lot of graduate students and undergraduate students from both UNC and State, which really sort of captured the spirit of the Chat Festival, combining art and technology, and getting people from different departments and different schools to work together. So, are there any questions? I don't know what they're planning on doing next year. We were trying to incorporate some gameplay components to it. That's probably the end goal, create more of a storyline. We could do some really basic things, like when the objects get close together, or when the characters get close together, they would repel apart. And so we wanted to have a sort of rock, paper, scissors like gameplay where if they got closer together, one would dominate and the other one would run away, sort of thing like that. And we ran into some time constraints and didn't get that implemented as nicely as we wanted to. But there could definitely, you could have like levels and a whole storyline and things like that. Yeah? The whole thing was pretty cool. I think I like the motion tracking the best. There were a lot of cool applications. We actually looked at a couple of different motion tracking systems before we chose this one, and that was pretty interesting. We were looking at an inertial motion tracking system, which uses sensors sort of like the ones in the Wiimote. The original concept actually had dancers wearing a suit with these sensors, and then we decided to go for something more interactive. And you can't really put like a Wiimote on one of these things and let audience members toss it around, so this worked better for us. Yeah, it was open to the public. Users actually weren't told anything. That was part of the idea, is we wanted it to be really intuitive. We ran into some problems with that. You can see in this picture there's a taped square on the floor. So we had these 12 cameras that were up in the balcony, and where the fields of view overlap, that was called the capture volume. And so when the objects were inside that sort of invisible cube, they could be tracked. Now we taped the square on the floor, and we thought the audience members would understand that they should stay inside. But that didn't work very well, and even when we told them that, we'd get a lot of people like standing at the edge and then waving the object out here, which also didn't work very well. Yeah, exactly. Any other questions? Yeah, okay.
Hello, everyone. My name is Austin Matthews, and I am going to talk to us today about another field of computer science, namely computational linguistics. My project is called Hooked on Phonics, and I will be looking at the phonotactic reconstruction of noisy phoneme strings. So first, we're going to go over a little bit of background. First of all, I'd like to define what a phoneme is. A phoneme is the basic unit of speech. It's a sound. It's kind of a subpiece of a letter. You have a letter like A, but yet that can be pronounced as A or A or A, several different things. These are all different phonemes. So the letter A may represent 4 or 5 different phonemes, but when you pronounce a word, you're actually pronouncing a sequence of phonemes, not necessarily a sequence of letters. And phonemes are classified based on the articulatory processes involved in producing them. And they're classified based on the strength and location of the airflow constrictions as they come through your mouth, nose, and throat. To represent phoneme strings on paper or on slides, there are many different standards that exist, but the one in primary use is the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet. I'm sure you're all familiar with it in passing from dictionaries. Most dictionaries use this as a notation for pronunciations. So the context of this is my research with Dr. Fabienne Monrose, where we're looking at voice over IP. And in particular, we're looking at encrypted voice communication and how to reconstruct it even though it's encrypted. And the way we do this is by looking at packet size information. There's an HMM, a hidden Markov model, just like was used in a couple of the other presentations, that looks at sequences of packet sizes. And from that, makes a hypothesis about what the underlying phoneme might be. And the reason why we can do this is because when the signal, the acoustic signal is compressed, it uses what's known as a variable bitrate codec, which essentially means that the more complex the waveform, the higher the bitrate of the transfer of the sound over the internet. So the implication here is that, and when it's encrypted, we use length-preserving stream ciphers, which means that we can still see, even on the wire, the complexity of the wave to some extent. So we classify these packet sizes into phoneme strings. But the problem we have is that now we've got a string of phonemes, we need a way to turn that back into English. And most voice recognition software requires a waveform. They operate on a waveform. They look for peaks or low amplitude areas in the waveform and will figure out where word boundaries are and things like that. And we don't have any access to any of that. And moreover, because we're doing this with a hidden Markov model, oftentimes the phonemes that we think we're identifying are slightly wrong. So we need a system that is resistant to noise and can turn written phoneme strings into English text. And so that's where my research comes in. Variable bitrate codecs are one of the things that I just mentioned. So but it's used by many major providers, such as Google Talk and Skype. And here we can see the complexity of waveform mapping to packet sizes. Bigger bars representing higher bitrate. And stream ciphers, again, preserve the length, the bitrate of the stream as it goes over the wire. All right, so we have a lot of noise in our identifications. We only get about 50% of the phonemes in a given utterance. About 50% of the phonemes are labeled correctly, but even more of them are close, meaning certain phonetic features are preserved or guessed correctly, but not all of them. And the other big issue here is that we don't have any spaces in our words. So we get a list of phonemes, no spaces. So it's like you're taking all the pronunciations of all the words in a sentence and slurring them together. Did I not just cover this? Interesting. All right. So as an overview of our approach, we're going to be doing a two-phase process where first we take a string of phonemes, like this sentence here, rock and roll, and we first are going to segment it into what we think are strings of phonemes that represent individual words. And then after that, we're going to be using another algorithm to figure out what word a given short phoneme string corresponds to. The first step is going to be the word break insertion. And we use an approach that was first outlined by Harrington and al. In 1988, where you look at sets of 3 phonemes, trigrams of phonemes in your string. And you first build a database over a large English corpus of all of the trigrams of phonemes that can occur in English words. And then when you get a string of phonemes, off of the wire in our case, we look through all the trigrams and we find ones that are impossible in English, that cannot occur within a single English word. And that indicates that there has to be a word break there. If it can't occur word internally, and it did occur, there has to be a space in there. But the problem with this is that since you have a trigram, there's 2 possible places for spaces. You could have it between the first and second phoneme or between the second and third phoneme. And so we need a way to resolve which one of those is correct. And the way we do that is by building a dictionary of beginning and endings of words. And when we are faced with 2 candidates, we can often eliminate one of them by ruling out the one with a invalid ending or beginning of a word. And the third phase of our approach is to look at the resulting pieces and use a dictionary lookup to see if we can go ahead and match anything with a dictionary. And I'm going to go through an example of this in a moment after I go through a few more details. So the first step is the phonetic triple step, where we iterate over each pronunciation in the dictionary. We build a database of all the possible triples of phonemes. And we go through, and like I said, we we know that a space must have occurred in one of the two interphoneme locations. So we're going to notate that with what we're calling a potential word break, which we notate with a question mark symbol. And we put the question mark symbol between the first and second phonemes. So a question mark indicates a space either where the question mark is or one space later. And then we're going to go and do boundary resolution. We're going to, again, build up our database of 1 and 2 grams that can start and end words. And for every potential word break that we inserted in the first step, we're going to examine the 2 possible cases. And anything that we deem invalid, we're going to rule out. And we're going to indicate a word break with the hash symbol, the pound symbol. And then in the dictionary lookup stage, we take a chunk between word break symbols, and we examine all possible segmentations of it. We look at the first 1 phoneme, and is that a word? We look at the first 2 phonemes, is that a word? The first 3, and we do that all the way up to the length of the thing. And we eventually hit all possible segmentations. And if there's any word breaks that are consistent across all possible segmentations, the only way to segment it involves that word break, we insert that too. And again, this will come up in an example if that explanation was not perfectly clear. So our example of the evening will be the exciting wedding. And this is the IPA pronunciation. The words have been color-coded, although again, we have no spaces. So the color coding is just for viewer convenience. We have V in red, exciting in green, and wedding in blue. So the first step here is to scan through all possible phoneme triples. And of course, all the ones within words are valid, but we're not sure about the ones near the word boundaries. So in particular, we have this triple iik and this other triple ngwa, which, if you think about it long and hard enough, or use a dictionary, are not valid in English. You cannot have those within a word. So we go ahead and we put in our potential word breaks. We know that it has to be either the exciting or the exciting. These are very hard to pronounce sometimes. So now we have 4 candidates. And we're going to try to rule them out using the initial and ending analysis. Obviously, as a human, your eye will immediately jump to the correct one. But to a computer, it's not that obvious. And the spelling of the non-English phrases is a little weird. I apologize if that's hard to read. So this is what we get when we go through our database of word endings and beginnings, is that of our 4 candidates, ik is a valid starting, but ngwa is not. So the first candidate gets ruled out. And by similar logic, you can have words that start with a KS sound, but not a word that ends with that begins with the NGW sound. So the first 2 candidates are now out. So we're left with these last 2 candidates, the exciting wedding and the exciting wedding. But we can't decide between them yet. So we have our 2 candidates. We can go ahead and rewrite the 2 candidates with 1 potential word break. That's just a notation change. And we're going to go for the dictionary stage. And when we're looking through this, we actually find that there are 2 possible segmenting. One is that you have the exciting wedding, and the other one is the exciting wedding. The first word break here between the and ik is consistent across all possible segmentations. There's no way we can have a word break anywhere else. So we go ahead and insert that, and now we actually have it completely segmented. We have essentially the exciting wedding. The problem here is that we're still not sure whether it's actually the exciting wedding or the exciting wedding. Of course, one's not grammatical, but the computer doesn't know that. So we do this, and we do this over the TIMIT dataset, which is a speech corpus of 630 speakers uttering a total of 6,300 sentences. And we take their utterances, we strip out the spaces, and we run them into this algorithm, run them through this algorithm, just to see what we do. And again, I said that due to the context, this needs to be robust to noise. And so we took the confusion table generated by Dr. Monroe's research, and we injected noise into the speaker's pronunciations. And again, tested the results at every 5 percentage points up to 100. And what we can see here is that with 0 noise percentage 0, we have about 88% of the word breaks get inserted correctly. That's pretty good. And with small amounts of noise, 5 or 10%, we're still above 80%. Everything's looking good. No major issues there. It quickly drops off with noise. What you'll notice is that because of the fact that we insert word breaks wherever you have a invalid trigram of phonemes, when you have a lot of noise, you're going to get a lot of invalid triples. And what that means is you insert a ton of word breaks. And hence, our recall, the percentage of word breaks that were actually there that we successfully insert is very high because we're just spamming word breaks. But our precision, the percentage of the word breaks that we guess that are actually correct, drops off very quickly. And the F-score is a way of combining these two measurements into a single number that has some meaning. So we're getting about 88% on the word break insertion. So we're going to go on to word matching. And that's where we're going to take these word segments, rock and roll, and try to convert them back into words. The methodology here is to use what is known as edit distance, or Levenstein distance, after the guy who invented it, in which you take two strings and you compare them, and you find the minimum number of operations that will transform the first string into the second. And by operation, I mean either a insertion of a letter, the deletion of a letter, or the substitution of one letter with another. But in our implementation, we weight these three operations a little bit, so that insertion and deletion still cost what they normally would, but edit distance cost is weighted according to which two phonemes are actually being substituted for one another. And the articulatory distance metric that we use is based on phonetic features. And every sound has at least three major features. We have to make a distinction here between vowels and consonants. Those are exactly what you think they are. And a vowel can be uniquely determined by three features: rounding, backness, and height. Rounding refers to the roundness of your lips when you say a vowel. You'll note that if you say oo, you have a nice circular feature in your lips, where if you say ah, you don't pucker your lips very much. Backness refers to how far back in your mouth your tongue is when you pronounce a letter, a vowel. And if you say e, if you say e and then oo, back and forth, e, oo, you'll note that your tongue moves forward for the e and backwards for the u. And vowel height is the height of your chin, or the height of the highest part of your tongue in your mouth as you pronounce a vowel. So if you say ah, e, I'm sure you can see my mouth going up and down as I'm saying this. And this makes a very natural continuum for vowels to be measured in. Consonants have a slightly different three features that we're going to use. They're voice, manner, and place. Voice refers to whether or not your vocal cords are vibrating during the vocalization. You can feel this very clearly if you say S and Z back to back. You can feel your throat vibrate when you say Z, and you can't when you say S. Manner of articulation is a little bit harder to explain in 30 seconds, but essentially it refers to the amount of constriction of airflow as you pronounce the sound. The more you impede the airflow, the lower on our chart. A stop is a complete and total lack of any airflow for a short period of time. A fricative, such as F in our diagram, is when you have a small hole and you're blowing air through it, so it comes out with a very turbulent sound. And an approximant is when you have very little impedance of airflow, so you have sounds like wa, where you have fairly continuous airflow all the way through the sound. Place of articulation is kind of like backness. It refers to where in your mouth you're creating a seal. You can either create it, like if you say B, you're creating a seal between your two lips. If you say a F sound, you're creating a seal between your upper teeth and your lower lip, etc. And that can go all the way back to where your tongue is pressing it up against the palate of your mouth, etc. So those are the three features that we use for each of these. And so this is the weighting that we're going to use to measure substitutions in our edit distance. And we do need some way of comparing vowels and consonants. We kind of glaze over that and just call it 1. This is a vowel chart of height. As I said, ah and e, you can feel your jaw moving up and down. And you can see with the tongue position, it is a very nice continuum. It's a very logical metric for distance between phonemes. And E is closer to an is closer, and then an is closer to an and then an is closer to an and these three features, each of these sets of three features are completely independent from each other. You can blow air through a small hole between your teeth and your lips, or between your tongue and your palate. It doesn't make any difference. So they're kind of orthogonal axes, if you will. So an example of this process, we're going to use the phrase an official deadline. And this is actually spoken by a Southern speaker. And so it actually comes out as an official deadline. And I did this on purpose to show that our approach is robust enough to handle slight variations in pronunciation, because none of these words actually show up in the dictionary in this form because of this speaker's slight accent. So we first look up the word n, and what we're doing here is we're going through every single pronunciation in the dictionary, and we're computing distance between every pair of pronunciations. And I've just shown the closest three here for comparison's sake, and a valid chart to reference to the right. On the x-axis is backness, and on the y-axis is vowel height. So here we have n, and it's matching to an, which is what we want it to do. And on the vowel chart, you can see the s sound is very close to the a sound. And there are other candidates. You could have n versus earn or n versus in, but neither of those match up quite as well. Although you'll notice that since all three of them, you're only changing the vowel a little bit. They all have very low distance scores. But nevertheless, we are going to pick out the match with the lowest distance score. In this case is an, which is exactly what we want it to be. It's not contrived or anything. Next we have the word official, which again we look up, and our closest three guys this time are not quite as pretty. It's actually official, eternal, and effects. A little bit weird, but what you'll notice if you compare is that, like in effects, you actually have the I and the F are the same. You have consonant and vowels in the correct positions, so you're not getting that huge penalty of substituting a vowel with a consonant, which is pretty unnatural to do that if you're, no matter what dialect you speak, generally vowels and consonants stay vowels and consonants. And so it still makes sense. And again, we're going to take the lowest one, which is a distance of 0.11 with official. And then the third word is very similar, deadline. And I forgot to change the table. Forgive me. It mapped to deadline, I promise. So we segment this out, and it goes to an official deadline, which is exactly what we wanted. And we've shown that it's already very resistant to variations in pronunciation due to dialect, or in our case, noise. Our algorithm, our hidden Markov model, is very good at getting manner of articulation, especially, like, it's very easy to pick up turbulence. If you're blowing air through a small hole, it has a very noisy acoustic signal, and the packet lengths become big, and it's fairly easy to pick up. So at the very least, you can get that. Even if we can't always nail exactly where it is in the backness of your mouth, we can get that, and that lets the distance metric do its magic to repair some of those issues. And to evaluate the correctness of our transcripts, we use the meteor metric, which is actually originally designed for machine translation. It compares your reference, the correct sentence, with your hypothesis sentence, which is what we're hypothesizing. And it uses a weighted combination of recall, precision, and fragmentation. As defined earlier, recall is the percentage of words in the hypothesis that occur in the reference. Precision is the percentage of words in the reference that occur in the hypothesis. And fragmentation is an extra little metric that tries to quantize the runs. Like if you get 3 words in a row correct, that's better than getting 1 word right, 1 word wrong, 1 word right, etc. So it penalizes you if your translation is too fragmented. And the original meteor metric also accounts for synonyms and stemming being where you have verbs that might be inflected or something, but you just change the tense, which our system is very prone to doing. And in this metric, scores range from 0 to 1, with anything above 0.5 being called understandable, and anything above 0.7 being called good or fluent. In our context, because if we hit a synonym, if we change big to huge, for example, that's purely lucky. That's probably a really bad thing. So we disabled the synonym matching for our purposes. Here's some examples of what our meteor scores look like. We have sentences here where we see only one very minor change lowers the meteor score pretty drastically. We have a score of 0.78, which is still in the fluent range. And I think that everybody can pretty well understand Cliff was soothed by the luxurious massage and by a luxurious massage. It's pretty much the same thing. It's a pretty common foreign speaker error. One that's a little bit harder to understand, but is still in the ballpark, right on the border of intelligibility, is not accept to create illuminated examples. The correct translation is on the right. And then an example of where meteor kind of messes up a little bit is in very short sentences where we have that you headache. It's actually pretty close to that's your headache, but unfortunately, meteor doesn't like it. We missed a third of the words, and one of the words, the yellow squares indicate a match by stemming, where you have a inflectional change at the end of the word. So we have one word right, one word wrong, and one word that's kind of half and half. So meteor gives us fragmentation penalties and everything, and it drops our score very low. But overall, we do fairly well with this. These are the results on the timid data set again, 6,300 sentences. It's actually divided into 8 dialects from all over America, from New England and the Midlands, southern New York City, everything. And so this is just one sentence. We actually did this in the context-dependent and context-independent cases where we would run it on all the other, how do I say this? You would have one sentence that we're testing on. In this case, it's don't ask me to carry an oily rag like that. And we would train over all the rest of the sentences. But this particular sentence was spoken by all 630 speakers. And so this is the data for over all dialects for all speakers. And as you can see by these box and whisker plots, on average, we're still getting translations that are about 0.8 meteor score, which is still in that good to fluent range. You see that there's many outliers towards the bottom of the range, and some of them are pretty bad. But in general, we're in the understandable range for sure, and we're even in the good range for most speakers when they say the sentence. Here's just some comical misinterpretations that our system had. But here, you'll notice that over the course of these, that it tends to mess up very much so on short words. The problem here is that if you have a word that's short and you accidentally replace one phoneme, these were taken at 10% noise, so there is some chance that a phoneme was replaced. That with very short words, you're very likely to accidentally stumble onto a replacement word. The space of 1 and 2 phoneme words is very dense, in other words. Whereas the space of 10 phonemes and words is not very dense, and if you replace one, you're very likely to match to the original intended word. So I'm sorry, but that shell has to search is house. It's close-ish. It's not perfect, but it's there. She had your dark suit and greasy wash water all year. I should mention the timid sentences are a little weird, but they're chosen to use all English phonemes and whatnot, so they're a little out there. She had your dwarf sea and greasy wash water all year. And the local drugstore was charged with elderly dispensing tranquilizers. Illegally elderly, it's kind of close, right? So we do reasonably well. And so we've completed my 2 tasks, my tasks of word segmentation and word classification. But this comes at the tail end of the longer process that Dr. Monroe's and a couple of grad students and I have been working on, where we take the packet lengths off the wire, we segment them, we turn them into phonemes, and we apply some language models to try to correct any noisy errors that we might have. And then I segment them, and then I turn them back into words. So this all fits together into this beautiful diagram. And it is the entire process is detailed very well in our paper, Phonotactic Reconstructions of Encrypted Voice over IP Conversations, Hoax on Phonics, that will be presented in about a month at the IEEE Symposium on Security and Privacy in Oakland, California. So look out for it in about a month. It'll be great. And thank you for listening.
Question for us. What is phonotactics?
Phonotactics, good call. Phonotactics is the is the allowed and disallowed combinations of phonemes within a given language. It definitely differs from language to language, but in English, ingwa cannot start a word, where in, who knows, in Swahili that might be completely valid.
What's the etymology?
Question. The etymology of phonotactics? That beats me. Phono, I believe, is that Greek? No, Latin. And tactics is tactics. I don't know. It made sense to me, I swear.
So is there a way to quantify how resistant to noise your approach is?
It's difficult. The best we've done is just been able to study how the recall and precision drop off with noise. I think in our case, it's precision that drops. There's not really a wonderful way to get out a single number. You can just get a graph of how your performance drops off with noise. First of all, I'm very interested in the fact that you say this has a lot of implications because I couldn't find any applications, because I couldn't find any outside of this one very specific thing. But that said, the whole system is set up so it doesn't really matter at all what language you're speaking. You need a dictionary of words in that language, and you're just studying the trigrams of phonemes in that language, and you're studying the words beginnings and endings, which you can do for any language. And then you need, obviously, a dictionary, which is what we use for the last part. The idea of distance between phonemes will hold up against any language you throw at it. So it should be really robust. We were actually discussing trying it on some other languages. In particular, I believe Chinese was discussed because of the fact that words tend to be one syllable and very easy to segment. And so we could see kind of how the edit distance algorithm works in the absence of space issues and things like that.